Hello and welcome to this cozy corner of peaceful storytelling. I'm Joanne, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 2 of our journey through Anne of Green Gables, a beloved tale that has warmed hearts for generations. Today, we continue exploring the enchanting world of Anne Shirley, with her boundless imagination and the breathtaking beauty of Prince Edward Island as our backdrop. Together, we'll return to Green Gables, where rolling hills, blooming wildflowers, and that iconic red-haired girl await us. If you enjoy soothing storytelling and relaxing bedtime content, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and join my wonderful community. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. It really helps support the channel and brings more stories to those who need them. Now, let's take a moment to unwind and settle in. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a quiet lane, lined with tall trees whose leaves whisper in the soft breeze. The night air is sweet, with the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. In the distance, you can hear the gentle lapping of the waves along the shore, a soothing rhythm calling you to let go of the day's worries. Imagine walking down this path, your footsteps light on the earth as the moonlight filters through the trees, casting a shimmering glow. You feel a sense of peace wash over you, as if you stepped into Anne's world, a world filled with wonder, beauty, and endless possibility. And so, my friend, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, let those shoulders relax. Let the tranquility of Green Gables embrace you as we now begin our story. Chapter 13. The Delights of Anticipation. "It's time Anne was in to do her sewing," said Marilla, glancing at the clock, and then out into the yellow August afternoon, where everything drowsed in the heat. "She stayed playing with Diana more than a half an hour more, and I gave her leave to. And now she's perched out there on the woodpile, talking to Matthew, 19 to the dozen, when she knows perfectly well she ought to be at her work. And of course he's listening to her like a perfect ninny. I never saw such an infatuated man. The more she talks, and the odder the things she says, the more he's delighted, evidently. Anne Shirley, you come right in here this minute. Do you hear me?" A series of staccato steps on the west window brought Anne flying in from the yard, eyes shining, cheeks faintly flushed with pink, unbraided hair streaming behind her in a torrent of brightness. "Oh, Marilla," she exclaimed breathlessly, "there's going to be a Sunday school picnic next week in Mr. Harmon Andrews' field, right near the Lake of Shining Waters. And Mrs. Superintendent Bell and Mrs. Rachel Lynde are going to make ice cream. Think of it, Marilla, ice cream! And, oh, Marilla, can I go to it?" "Just look at the clock, if you please, Anne. What time did I tell you to come in?" 2 o'clock. But isn't it splendid about the picnic, Marilla? Please, can I go? Oh, I've never been to a picnic." I've dreamed of picnics, but I've never— Yes, I told you to come at 2:00, and it's 2:45. I'd like to know why you didn't obey me, Anne." "Why, I meant to, Marilla, as much as could be, but you have no idea how fascinating Idlewild is. And then, of course, I had to tell Matthew about the picnic. Matthew's such a sympathetic listener. Please, can I go?" "You'll have to learn to resist the fascination of idle whatever you call it. When I tell you to come in at a certain time, I mean that time, and not a half an hour later. And you needn't stop to discourse with sympathetic listeners on your way either. As for the picnic, of course you can go. You're a Sunday school scholar, and it's not likely I'd refuse to let you go when all the other little girls are going." But, faltered Anne, "Diana says that everybody must take a basket of things to eat. I can't cook, as you know, Marilla, and I don't mind going to a picnic without puffed sleeves so much, but I'd feel terribly humiliated if I had to go without a basket. It's been preying on my mind ever since Diana told me." "Well, it needn't prey any longer. I'll bake you a basket." "Oh, you dear, good Marilla. Oh, you're so kind to me. Oh, I'm so much obliged to you." Getting through with her O's, Anne cast herself into Marilla's arms and rapturously kissed her sallow cheek. It was the first time in her whole life that childish lips had voluntarily touched Marilla's face. Again, that sudden sensation of startling sweetness thrilled her. She was secretly vastly pleased at Anne's impulsive caress, which was probably the reason why she said brusquely, There, never mind your kissing nonsense. I'd sooner see you do strictly as you're told. As for cooking, I mean to begin giving you lessons in that some of these days. But you're so feather-brained, Anne. I've been waiting to see if you'd sober down a little and learn to be steady before I begin. You've got to keep your wits about you in cooking and not stop in the middle of things to let your thoughts rove all over creation. Now, get out your patchwork and have your square done before tea time." "I do not like patchwork," said Anne dolefully, hunting out her work basket and sitting down before a little heap of red and white diamonds with a sigh. "I think some kinds of sewing would be nice, but there's no scope for imagination in patchwork. It's just one little seam after another, and you never seem to be getting anywhere. But of course, I'd rather be Anne of Green Gables sewing patchwork than Anne of any other place with nothing to do but play. I wish time went as quick sewing patches as it does when I'm playing with Diana, though. Oh, we do have such elegant times, Marilla. I have to furnish most of the imagination, but I'm well able to do that. Diana is simply perfect in every other way. You know that little piece of land across the brook that runs up between our farm and Mr. Barry's? It belongs to Mr. William Bell, and right in the corner there is a little ring of white birch trees, the most romantic spot, Marilla. Diana and I have our playhouse there. We call it Idlewild. Isn't that a poetical name? I assure you it took me some time to think it out. I stayed awake nearly a whole night before I invented it. Then, just as I was dropping off to sleep, it came like an inspiration. Diana was enraptured when she heard it. We have got our house fixed up elegantly. You must come and see it, Marilla, won't you? We have great big stones, all covered with moss for seats, and boards from tree to tree for shelves. And we have all our dishes on them. Of course, they're all broken, but it's the easiest thing in the world to imagine that they're whole. There's a piece of a plate with a spray of red and yellow ivy on it that is especially beautiful. We keep it in the parlor, and we have the fairy glass there too. The fairy glass is as lovely as a dream. Diana found it in the woods behind the chicken house. It's all full of rainbows, just little young rainbows that haven't grown big yet. And Diana's mother told her it was broken off a hanging lamp they once had. but it's nice to imagine the fairies lost it one night when they had a ball, so we call it the fairy glass. Matthew's going to make us a table. Oh, we've named that little round pool over in Mr. Barry's field Willowmere. I got that name out of the book Diana lent me. That was a thrilling book, Marilla. The heroine had 5 lovers. I'd be satisfied with one, wouldn't you? She was very handsome, and she went through great tribulations. She could faint as easy as anything. I'd love to be able to faint, wouldn't you, Marilla? It's so romantic. But I'm really very healthy, for all I'm so thin. I believe I'm getting fatter, though. Don't you think I am? I look at my elbows every morning when I get up to see if any dimples are coming. Diana's having a new dress made with elbow sleeves. She's going to wear it to the picnic. Oh, I do hope it will be fine next Wednesday. I don't feel that I could enjoy the disappointment if anything happened to prevent me from getting to the picnic. I suppose I'd live through it, but I'm certain it would be a lifelong sorrow. It wouldn't matter if I got to 100 picnics in after years. They wouldn't make up for missing this one. They're going to have boats on the Lake of Shining Waters, and ice cream, as I told you. I've never tasted ice cream. Diana tried to explain what it was like, but I guess ice cream is one of those things that are beyond imagination. Anne, you have talked even on for 10 minutes by the clock, said Marilla. Now, just for curiosity's sake, see if you can hold your tongue for the same length of time. Anne held her tongue as desired, but for the rest of the week she talked picnic and thought picnic and dreamed picnic. On Saturday it rained, and she worked herself up into a frantic state, lest it should keep on raining until and over Wednesday that Marilla made her sew an extra patchwork square by way of steadying her nerves. On Sunday, Anne confided to Marilla on the way from church that she grew actually cold all over with excitement when the minister announced the picnic from the pulpit. Such a thrill as went up and down my back, Marilla. I don't think I'd ever really believed until then that there was honestly going to be a picnic. I couldn't help fearing I'd only imagined it. But when a minister says a thing in the pulpit, you just have to believe it. You set your heart too much on things, Anne, said Marilla with a sigh. I'm afraid there'll be a great many disappointments in store for you through life. Oh, Marilla, looking forward to things is half the pleasure of them, exclaimed Anne. You may not get the things themselves, but nothing can prevent you from having fun of looking forward to them. Mrs. Lynde says, "Blessed are they who expect nothing, for they shall not be disappointed." But I think it would be worse to expect nothing than to be disappointed. Marilla wore her amethyst brooch to church that day as usual. Marilla always wore her amethyst brooch to church. She would have thought it rather sacrilegious to leave it off, as bad as forgetting her Bible or her collection dime. That amethyst brooch was Marilla's most treasured possession. A seafaring uncle had given it to her mother, who in turn had bequeathed it to Marilla. It was an old-fashioned oval, containing a braid of her mother's hair, surrounded by a border of very fine amethysts. Marilla knew too little about precious stones to realize how fine the amethysts actually were, but she thought them very beautiful, and was always pleasantly conscious of their violet shimmer at her throat, above her good brown satin dress, even although she could not see it. Anne had been smitten with delighted admiration when she first saw that brooch. Oh, Marilla, it's a perfectly elegant brooch. I don't know how you can pay attention to the sermon or the prayers when you have it on. I couldn't, I know. I think amethysts are just sweet. They are what I used to think diamonds were like. Long ago, before I had ever seen a diamond, I read about them, and I tried to imagine what they would be like. I thought they would be lovely glimmering purple stones. When I saw a real diamond in a lady's ring one day, I was so disappointed I cried. Of course it was very lovely, but it wasn't my idea of a diamond. Will you let me hold the brooch for 1 minute, Marilla? Do you think amethysts can be the souls of good violets? Chapter 14, Anne's Confession. On the Monday evening before the picnic, Marilla came down from her room with a troubled face. Anne, she said, to that small personage, who was shelling peas by the spotless table and singing Nellie of the Hazel Dell with a vigor and expression that did credit to Diana's teaching. Did you see anything of my amethyst brooch? I thought I stuck it in my pincushion when I came home from church yesterday evening, but I can't find it anywhere. I saw it this afternoon when you were away at the Aid Society, said Anne, a little slowly. I was passing your door when I saw it on the cushion, so I went in to look at it. Did you touch it? Said Marilla sternly. Yes, admitted Anne. I took it up and I pinned it on my breast just to see how it would look. You had no business to do anything of the sort. It's very wrong in a little girl to meddle. You shouldn't have gone into my room in the first place, and you shouldn't have touched a brooch that didn't belong to you in the second. Where did you put it? Oh, I put it back on the bureau. I hadn't it on a minute. Truly, I didn't mean to meddle, Marilla. I didn't think about its being wrong to go in and try on the brooch, but I see now that it was, and I'll never do it again. That's one good thing about me. I never do the same naughty thing twice. You didn't put it back, said Marilla. That brooch isn't anywhere on the bureau. You've taken it out or something, Anne. I did put it back, said Anne quickly, pertly, Marilla thought. I don't just remember where I stuck it on the pincushion or laid it in the china tray, but I'm perfectly certain I put it back. I'll go and have another look, said Marilla, determining to be just. If you put that brooch back, it's there still. If it isn't, I'll know you didn't, that's all. Marilla went to her room and made a thorough search, not only over the bureau, but in every other place she thought the brooch might possibly be. It was not to be found, and she returned to the kitchen. Anne, the brooch is gone. By your admission, you were the last person to handle it. Now, what have you done with it? Tell me the truth at once. Did you take it out and lose it? No, I didn't, said Anne solemnly, meeting Marilla's angry gaze squarely. I never took the brooch from your room, and that's the truth, even if it means being punished for it, though I'm not exactly sure what being punished would involve. So there, Marilla. Anne's "so there" was only intended to emphasize her assertion, but Marilla took it as a display of defiance. I believe you're telling me a falsehood, Anne, she said sharply. I know you are. There now, don't say anything more unless you're prepared to tell the whole truth. Go to your room and stay there until you're ready to confess. Will I take the peas with me? Said Anne meekly. No, I'll finish shelling them myself. Do as I bid you. When Anne had gone, Marilla went about her evening tasks in a very disturbed state of mind. She was worried about her valuable brooch. What if Anne had lost it? And how wicked of the child to deny having taken it, when anybody could see she must have, with such an innocent face, too. I don't know what would have been worse, thought Marilla as she nervously shelled the peas. Of course, I don't think she meant to steal it. She probably just took it to play with, or to fuel her imagination. She must have taken it, that's clear, because no one else has been in that room since she was there, according to her story, until I went up tonight. And the brooch is gone, no doubt about it. I suppose she's lost it and is afraid to admit it for fear of being punished. It's dreadful to think she might be lying. That's far worse than her temper. It's a huge responsibility to have a child in your home that you can't trust. Slyness and dishonesty, that's what she's shown. I feel worse about that than about the brooch. If only she had told the truth, I wouldn't mind so much. Marilla searched her room throughout the evening for the brooch but couldn't find it. A bedtime check in the east gable also turned up nothing. Anne kept denying she knew anything about the brooch, but Marilla was convinced otherwise. The next morning, Marilla told Matthew the story. He was confused and puzzled. He didn't want to lose faith in Anne, but had to admit things didn't look good for her. "Are you sure it didn't fall behind the bureau?" was his only suggestion. "I've moved the bureau, taken out the drawers, and looked in every nook and cranny," Marilla replied firmly. "The brooch is gone, and that child has taken it and lied about it. That's the harsh truth, Matthew Cuthbert, and we need to face it." "So what are you going to do about it?" Matthew asked sadly, feeling relieved that Marilla was handling the situation. He had no desire to get involved this time. "She'll stay in her room until she confesses," said Marilla firmly, recalling the success of this method before. "Then we'll see. Maybe we can find the brooch if she tells us where she took it, but she'll still need to be punished, Matthew." "Well, you'll have to punish her," said Matthew, putting on his hat. "Remember, you told me to stay out of it." Marilla felt abandoned by everyone. She couldn't even ask Mrs. Lynde for advice. She went up to the east gable with a serious face and came back looking even more serious. Anne refused to confess, insisting she hadn't taken the brooch. She'd been crying, and Marilla felt a pang of pity, which she sternly repressed. By night, she was, as she put it, worn out. "You'll stay in this room until you confess, Anne. Make up your mind to that," she said firmly. "But the picnic's tomorrow, Marilla," cried Anne. "You won't keep me from going, will you? Just let me out for the afternoon, and I'll stay here as long as you like afterwards. But I must go to the picnic." "You won't go to picnics or anywhere else until you've confessed, Anne." "Oh, Marilla," gasped Anne. But Marilla had already left and shut the door. Wednesday morning dawned bright and fair, perfect for a picnic. Birds sang around Green Gables, and the garden's Madonna lilies sent their sweet scent through the doors and windows. The birches waved as if expecting Anne's usual morning greeting from the east gable, but Anne was not at her window. When Marilla brought her breakfast, she found Anne sitting primly on her bed, pale and determined, with tightly shut lips and gleaming eyes. "Marilla, I'm ready to confess." "Ah," Marilla set down the tray. Her method had worked again, but this success felt very bitter. "Let's hear what you have to say then, Anne." "I took the amethyst brooch," said Anne, as if reciting a lesson. "I took it just as you said. I didn't mean to take it when I went in, but it looked so beautiful when I pinned it on my dress. I was overcome by temptation. I imagined how thrilling it would be to take it to Idlewild and pretend I was Lady Cordelia Fitzgerald. It would be much easier to imagine if I had a real amethyst brooch. Diana and I make necklaces of roseberries, but roseberries are nothing compared to amethysts. So I took the brooch. I thought I could put it back before you came home. I took the long way around to buy some time. When I was crossing the bridge over the lake's shining waters, I took the brooch off to look at it again. Oh, how it shone in the sunlight. But then, as I was leaning over the bridge, it slipped through my fingers and fell down, 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 sparkling all the way, and sank beneath the lake of shining waters. That's the best I can do at confessing, Marilla." Marilla felt a surge of anger. This child had taken and lost her treasured amethyst brooch, and now calmly recited the details without any apparent guilt or remorse. "Anne, this is terrible," Marilla said, trying to stay calm. "You are the wickedest girl I've ever heard of." "Yes, I suppose I am," Anne agreed calmly. "I know I need to be punished. It's your duty to punish me, Marilla. Can you do it quickly? I'd like to go to the picnic with nothing on my mind." "Picnic? You'll go to no picnic today, Anne Shirley. That will be your punishment, and it's not nearly severe enough for what you've done." "Not go to the picnic?" Anne jumped up and grabbed Marilla's hand. "But you promised I could go." "Oh, Marilla, I must go to the picnic. That's why I confessed. Punish me any other way, but please let me go to the picnic. Think of the ice cream. I may never have another chance to taste ice cream." Marilla firmly pulled Anne's hands away. "Don't plead, Anne. You are not going to the picnic, and that's final. No more talking about it." Anne saw that Marilla wouldn't change her mind. She clasped her hands, let out a loud cry, and threw herself on the bed, crying and writhing in despair. "For heaven's sake," gasped Marilla, hurrying out of the room. "I believe the child is crazy. No sensible child would act like this. If she's not crazy, she's just bad. Oh dear, maybe Rachel was right all along, but I've committed to this, and I won't turn back now." It was a miserable morning. Marilla worked fiercely, scrubbing the porch floor and the dairy shelves, even though they didn't need it. Then she went outside and raked the yard. When lunch was ready, she called Anne. A tear-stained face appeared, looking tragically over the banisters. "Come down to your lunch, Anne." "I don't want any lunch, Marilla," said Anne, sobbing. "I can't eat. My heart is broken. Someday you'll feel guilty for breaking it, but I forgive you. Remember that I forgive you, but please don't ask me to eat anything, especially boiled pork and greens. Boiled pork and greens are so unromantic when one is suffering." Frustrated, Marilla went back to the kitchen and told Matthew what had happened. Matthew, caught between wanting to be fair and feeling sorry for Anne, was very unhappy. "Well now, she shouldn't have taken the brooch or lied about it," Matthew admitted, sadly looking at his plate of pork and beans, feeling it was not right food for such a situation. "But she's such a little thing, such an interesting little thing. Don't you think it's pretty harsh not to let her go to the picnic when she wants to go so badly?" "Matthew Cuthbert, I'm amazed at you. I think I've been too easy on her. She doesn't seem to realize how wrong she's been. That's what worries me most. If she felt sorry, it wouldn't be so bad. And you don't seem to realize it either. You're always making excuses for her. I can see that." "Well now, she's such a little thing," Matthew weakly repeated. "And allowances should be made, Marilla. You know she's never had any proper upbringing." "Well, she's getting it now," Marilla retorted. Matthew was silenced but not convinced. The meal was very dismal. The only cheerful one was Jerry Boode, the hired boy, which Marilla found annoying. After washing the dishes, setting the bread sponge, and feeding the hens, Marilla remembered a small tear in her best black lace shawl. She decided to mend it. The shawl was in a box in her trunk. As she lifted it out, the sunlight shining through the window vines revealed something sparkling in the shawl. Marilla gasped and grabbed it. It was the amethyst brooch, caught by its clasp on a thread of lace. "Dear life and heart," said Marilla in surprise. "What does this mean? Here's my brooch, safe and sound, that I thought was at the bottom of Barry's pond. What did that girl mean by saying she took it and lost it? I believe Green Gables is bewitched. I remember now that when I took off my shawl on Monday afternoon, I laid it on the bureau for a minute. The brooch must have gotten caught in it somehow." Marilla went to the east gable, brooch in hand. Anne had cried herself out and was sitting sadly by the window. "Anne Shirley," said Marilla solemnly, "I've just found my brooch hanging on my black lace shawl. Now, I want to know what that story you told me this morning meant." "Well, you said you'd keep me here until I confessed," Anne replied tiredly. "So I decided to confess because I was determined to go to the picnic. I made up a confession last night and practiced it so I wouldn't forget it. But you wouldn't let me go to the picnic anyway, so all my effort was wasted." Marilla had to laugh despite herself, but she felt guilty. "Anne, you're something else. But I was wrong. I see that now. I shouldn't have doubted you when you've never lied to me before. Of course, it wasn't right for you to confess to something you didn't do. That was very wrong. But I pushed you into it. So if you'll forgive me, I'll forgive you, and we'll start fresh. Now get ready for the picnic." Anne jumped up like a rocket. "Oh, Marilla, isn't it too late?" "No, it's only 2:00. They won't be fully gathered yet, and it will be an hour before they have tea. Wash your face, comb your hair, and put on your gingham dress. I'll pack a basket for you. There's plenty of food in the house. And I'll get Jerry to hitch up the sorrel and drive you to the picnic." "Oh, Marilla," exclaimed Anne, rushing to the washstand. "5 minutes ago I was so miserable I wished I'd never been born. And now I wouldn't trade places with an angel." Chapter 15. A Tempest in the School Teapot. "What a splendid day," said Anne, taking a deep breath. "Isn't it wonderful just to be alive on a day like this? I feel sorry for people who aren't born yet because they're missing it. They might have good days, but they can never have this one. And it's even better to have such a lovely way to walk to school, isn't it?" "It's much nicer than going by the road that's so dusty and hot," said Diana practically, peeking into her lunch basket and mentally calculating how to divide the 3 juicy raspberry tarts among 10 girls. The girls at Avonlea School always shared their lunches, and eating 3 raspberry tarts alone, or even just with your best friend, would be considered awful mean. But when the tarts were divided among 10 girls, you only got a tiny bite. The path Anne and Diana took to school was very pretty. Anne thought those walks with Diana were perfect and couldn't be improved, even in her imagination. Walking by the main road would have been so dull, but going by Lover's Lane, Willowmere, Violet Vale, and the Birch Path was truly romantic. Lover's Lane started below the orchard at Green Gables and stretched far into the woods, ending at the Cuthbert farm. It was used to take cows to the back pasture and haul wood in the winter. Anne had named it Lover's Lane within a month of arriving at Green Gables. "Not that lovers really walk there," she explained to Marilla, "but Diana and I are reading a wonderful book that has a Lover's Lane in it, so we wanted one too. Isn't it a pretty name? So romantic. We can imagine lovers walking there. I like that lane because you can think out loud without people thinking you're crazy." Anne, started out alone in the morning, went down Lover's Lane to the brook. There Diana met her, and the 2 girls walked up the lane under the leafy maple trees. "Maples are such sociable trees," said Anne. "They're always rustling and whispering to you." They walked until they reached a rustic bridge. Then they left the lane, walked through Mr. Barry's back field, and past Willowmere. Beyond Willowmere was Violet Vale, a little green spot in the shadow of Mr. Andrew Bell's big woods. There are no violets there now, Anne told Marilla, but Diana says there are millions in the spring. Can't you just imagine seeing them? It takes my breath away. I named it Violet Vale. Diana says I'm good at coming up with fancy names for places. It's nice to be clever at something, isn't it? But Diana named the Birch Path. She wanted to, so I let her. But I could have thought of something more poetic than plain Birch Path. Anyone can come up with that. But the Birch Path is one of the prettiest places in the world, Marilla. It really was. Other people thought so too when they found it. It was a narrow, winding path going down a long hill through Mr. Bell's woods, where the light filtered through so many green leaves that it looked as flawless as a diamond. It was lined with slim young birches, white-stemmed and graceful, ferns, starflowers, wild lilies of the valley, and scarlet pigeonberries grew thickly along it. The air was always spicy, filled with bird calls and the murmur and laughter of the wind in the trees. Sometimes you might see a rabbit if you were quiet, which with Anne and Diana happened about once in a blue moon. In the valley, the path led to the main road, and then it was just up the spruce hill to the school. The Avonlea School was a whitewashed building with low eaves and wide windows. Inside, it had comfortable, old-fashioned desks covered with the initials and carvings of 3 generations of school children. The schoolhouse was set back from the road, and behind it was a shady fir wood and a brook where all children put their bottles of milk in the morning to keep them cool and fresh until lunchtime. Marilla watched Anne head off to school on the first day of September with many worries. Anne was such an unusual girl. How would she get along with the other children, and how would she ever manage to stay quiet during school? Things went better than Marilla feared. Anne came home that evening in high spirits. "I think I'm going to like school here," she said. "I don't think much of the teacher, though. He's always curling his mustache and making eyes at Prissy Andrews. Prissy is grown up, you know. She's 16 and studying for the entrance exam to Queen's Academy next year. Tilly Boulter says the teacher's in love with her. She has a beautiful complexion and curly brown hair, and she styles it so elegantly. She sits at the back, and he spends most of his time there too. He says he's explaining her lessons, but Ruby Gillis says she saw him write something on her slate, and when Prissy read it, she blushed and giggled. Ruby doesn't believe it was about the lesson." "Anne Shirley, don't talk about your teacher like that," said Marilla sharply. "You go to school to learn, not to criticize. I hope you behaved yourself." "Indeed I did," said Anne. "It wasn't as hard as you might think. I sit with Diana. Our seat is by the window, and we can see the lake of shining waters. There are many nice girls at school, and we had fun playing at lunchtime. It's nice to have lots of girls to play with, but I like Diana best and always will. I'm far behind the others in schoolwork. They're all in the 5th book, and I'm only in the 4th. I feel it's a bit disgraceful, but none of them have as much imagination as I do. We had reading, geography, Canadian history, and dictation today. Mr. Phillips said my spelling was disgraceful and showed my slate to everyone. I felt so embarrassed. He could have been nicer to a newcomer. Ruby Gillis gave me an apple. Sophie Sloane lent me a lovely pink card with "May I see your home" on it. Tilly Boulter let me wear her bead ring all afternoon. Can I have some of those pearl beads from your old pincushion to make a ring? And, Marilla, Jane Andrews told me that Minnie McPherson heard Prissy Andrews tell Sarah Gillis that I have a very pretty nose. That's the first compliment I've ever had, and it made me feel so strange. Marilla, do I really have a pretty nose? I know you'll tell me the truth. Your nose is fine, said Marilla shortly. Secretly, she thought Anne's nose was very pretty, but she didn't want to tell her. That was 3 weeks ago, and everything had gone smoothly so far. Now, on this crisp September morning, Anne and Diana were happily walking down the birch path, 2 of the happiest little girls in Avonlea. I guess Gilbert Blythe will be in school today, said Diana. He's been visiting his cousins in New Brunswick all summer and just came home Saturday night. He's awfully handsome, Anne, and he teases the girls a lot. He really torments us. Diana's tone suggested she didn't mind the teasing so much. Gilbert Blythe, said Anne. Isn't his name written on the porch wall with Julia bells and a big take notice over them? Yes, said Diana, tossing her head, but I'm sure he doesn't like Julia Bell that much. I heard him say he studied the multiplication table by her freckles. Oh, don't talk about freckles to me, begged Anne. It's not polite when I have so many, but I do think writing take notices on the wall about boys and girls is the silliest thing ever. I'd like to see anyone dare to write my name with a boy's. Not that anyone would, she added quickly. Anne sighed. She didn't want her name written up, but it was a bit humiliating to know it wouldn't be. Nonsense, said Diana, whose black eyes and glossy hair had made many Avonlea schoolboys write her name in take notices. It's just a joke, and don't be too sure your name won't ever be written up. Charlie Sloane likes you. He told his mother you were the smartest girl in school. That's better than being good-looking. No, it isn't, said Anne. I'd rather be pretty than clever. And I hate Charlie Sloane. I can't stand boys with goggle eyes. If anyone wrote my name with his, I'd never get over it, Diana Barry. But it is nice to be at the top of the class. You'll have Gilbert in your class now, said Diana, and he's used to being the best. He's in the 4th book, even though he's nearly 14. 4 years ago, his father was sick, and they went to Alberta for his health, so Gilbert didn't go to school much until they came back. It won't be easy to stay atop now, Anne. I'm glad, said Anne quickly. I couldn't really be proud of being the best among little kids. I got to the top yesterday by spelling abolition. Josie Pye was ahead of me, and she peeked in her book. Mr. Phillips didn't see her. He was looking at Prissy Andrews, but I did. I gave her a look of freezing scorn, and she turned as red as a beet and spelled it wrong anyway. Those Pye girls are cheats all around, said Diana indignantly as they climbed the fence to the main road. Gertie Pye actually put her milk bottle in my spot in the brook yesterday. Can you believe it? I don't speak to her now. When Mr. Phillips was in the back of the room helping Prissy Andrews with Latin, Diana whispered to Anne, That's Gilbert Blythe sitting right across the aisle from you, Anne. Look at him and see if you think he's handsome. Anne looked and saw Gilbert Blythe stealthily pinning Ruby Gillis's long yellow braid to the back of her seat. He was a tall boy with curly brown hair, mischievous hazel eyes, and a teasing smile. Ruby Gillis stood up to take a sum to the teacher and fell back with a shriek, thinking her hair was pulled out by the roots. Everyone looked at her, and Mr. Phillips glared sternly, making Ruby cry. Gilbert had hidden the pin and was pretending to study his history with a serious face. When the commotion settled, he looked at Anne and winked playfully. I think Gilbert Blythe is handsome, Anne confided to Diana, but I think he's very bold. It's not good manners to wink at a girl you don't know. But it wasn't until afternoon that things really started to happen. Mr. Phillips was in the corner explaining algebra to Prissy Andrews, and the rest of the students were doing as they pleased. eating green apples, whispering, drawing on their slates, and playing with crickets on strings. Gilbert Blythe was trying to get Anne Shirley to look at him, but she was completely absorbed in a daydream, staring at the blue view of the lake of shining waters through the window. Gilbert wasn't used to being ignored. He wanted the red-haired Shirley girl with the pointed chin and big, unusual eyes to look at him. He reached across the aisle, picked up the end of Anne's long red braid, held it out and whispered loudly, "Carrots, carrots." Then Anne looked at him with fury. She did more than look. She jumped to her feet, her daydreams shattered. She gave Gilbert a furious glance, her eyes sparkling with angry tears. "You mean, hateful boy," she shouted passionately. "How dare you?" And then whack! Anne brought her slate down on Gilbert's head, cracking the slate, not his head, in half. Avonlea School loved a scene, and this one was especially entertaining. Everyone gasped in horror and delight. Diana gasped. Ruby Gillis, prone to being hysterical, started crying. Tommy Sloane let his team of crickets escape as he stared, mouth open. Mr. Phillips marched down the aisle and put his hand heavily on Anne's shoulder. "Anne Shirley, what does this mean?" he said angrily. Anne didn't answer. It was too much to expect her to say in front of the whole school that she had been called carrots. Gilbert spoke up bravely. "It was my fault, Mr. Phillips. I teased her." Mr. Phillips ignored Gilbert. "I am sorry to see a pupil of mine displaying such temper and vindictiveness," he said solemnly, as if being his pupil should remove all bad behavior. "Anne, go stand on the platform in front of the blackboard for the rest of the afternoon." Anne would have much preferred a whipping to this punishment, which felt like a lash to her sensitive spirit. With a pale, set face, she obeyed. Mr. Phillips took a chalk crayon and wrote on the blackboard above her head, "Anne Shirley has a very bad temper. Anne Shirley must learn to control her temper." He read it out loud so even the youngest students who couldn't read writing would understand. Anne stood there the rest of the afternoon with that writing above her. She didn't cry or hang her head. Her anger was still too strong. With resentful eyes and red cheeks, she faced Diana's sympathetic look, Charlie Sloane's indignant nods, and Josie Pye's malicious smiles. As for Gilbert Blythe, she refused to look at him. She would never look at him again. She would never speak to him. When school was dismissed, Anne marched out with her head held high. Gilbert Blythe tried to stop her at the porch door. "I'm really sorry I made fun of your hair, Anne," he whispered contritely. "Honestly, I am. Don't stay mad forever, okay?" Anne swept by him disdainfully, without a sign of hearing. "Oh, how could you, Anne?" breathed Diana as they walked down the road, half reproachful, half admiring. Diana felt she could never have resisted Gilbert's apology. "I will never forgive Gilbert Blythe," said Anne firmly. "And Mr. Phillips spelled my name without an E, too. That's deeply hurtful, Diana." Diana had no idea what Anne meant, but she knew it was something terrible. "You shouldn't mind Gilbert making fun of your hair," she said soothingly. "He makes fun of all the girls. He laughs at mine because it's so black. He's called me a crow a dozen times, and I've never heard him apologize before." "There's a big difference between being called a crow and being called carrots," said Anne with dignity. "Gilbert Blythe has hurt my feelings terribly, Diana. The matter might have blown over without more trouble, if nothing else had happened. But when things start to happen, They often keep happening. Avonlea scholars often spent their lunch hour picking gum in Mr. Bell's spruce grove over the hill and across his big pasture field. From there, they could keep an eye on Eben Wright's house, where the teacher boarded. When they saw Mr. Phillips coming out, they would run for the schoolhouse. But since the distance was about 3 times longer than Mr. Wright's lane, they often arrived breathless and a few minutes late. The next day, Mr. Phillips, in a rare moment of strictness, announced before going home for lunch that he expected all students to be in their seats when he returned. Anyone who came in late would be punished. All the boys and some of the girls went to Mr. Bell's spruce grove as usual, planning to stay only briefly. But spruce groves are tempting. They picked and lingered, losing track of time until Jimmy Glover shouted from the top of an old spruce, "Master's coming!" The girls on the ground started first and managed to reach the schoolhouse just in time. The boys, who had to climb down from trees, were later, and Anne, who hadn't been picking gum at all but was wandering at the far end of the grove, waist deep in bracken and singing softly to herself, with a wreath of rice lilies in her hair, was the latest of all. Anne could run like a deer, though, and she did, overtaking the boys at the door and getting swept into the schoolhouse just as Mr. Phillips was hanging up his hat. Mr. Phillips' brief moment of strictness was over. He didn't want the hassle of punishing a dozen students, but he had to do something to save face. So he looked for a scapegoat and found it in Anne, who had dropped into her seat, gasping for breath, with a forgotten lily wreath hanging askew over one ear, giving her a disheveled look. "Anne Shirley, since you seem to enjoy the boys' company so much, we'll indulge your taste for it this afternoon," he said sarcastically. "Take those flowers out of your hair and sit with Gilbert Blythe." The other boys snickered. Diana, turning pale with pity, plucked the wreath from Anne's hair and squeezed her hand. Anne stared at the teacher as if she had turned to stone. "Did you hear what I said, Anne?" asked Mr. Phillips sternly. "Yes, sir," said Anne slowly, "but I didn't think you really meant it." "I assure you I did," he said, still with the sarcastic tone that all children, especially Anne, hated. It felt like a raw wound. "Obey me at once." For a moment, Anne looked like she might disobey. Then, realizing she had no choice, she stood up haughtily, crossed the aisle, sat down beside Gilbert Blythe, and buried her face in her arms on the desk. Ruby Gillis, who saw her face as it went down, told the others on the way home that she had actually never seen anything like it. It was so white, with awful little red spots in it. To Anne, this was the end of the world. Being singled out for punishment among equally guilty ones was bad enough. Being sent to sit with a boy was worse. But that boy being Gilbert Blythe was an unbearable insult. Anne felt she couldn't bear it, and it was useless to try. She was consumed with shame, anger, and humiliation. At first, the other students looked, whispered, giggled, and nudged each other. But as Anne never lifted her head, and Gilbert worked on fractions as if he was completely absorbed, they soon returned to their own tasks and forgot about Anne. When Mr. Phillips called the history class, Anne didn't move, and Mr. Phillips, distracted by writing verses to Priscilla, didn't notice. Once, when no one was looking, Gilbert took a little pink candy heart with a gold motto, "You are sweet," from his desk and slipped it under Anne's arm. Anne stood up, took the candy gingerly between her fingers, dropped it on the floor, crushed it to powder beneath her heel, and went back to her position without looking at Gilbert. When school was out, Anne marched to her desk, ostentatiously took out everything: books, writing tablet, pen and ink, testament, and arithmetic, and piled them neatly on her cracked slate. "What are you taking all those things home for, Anne?" Diana asked as soon as they were on the road. She hadn't dared to ask before. "I'm not coming back to school anymore," said Anne. Diana gasped and stared at Anne to see if she was serious. "Will Marilla let you stay home?" she asked. "She'll have to," said Anne. "I'll never go to school to that man again." "Oh, Anne," Diana looked like she was about to cry. "I think you're mean. What shall I do? Mr. Phillips will make me sit with that horrid Gertie Pye. I know he will because she's sitting alone. Please come back, Anne." "I'd do almost anything for you, Diana," said Anne sadly. "I'd let myself be torn limb from limb if it would help you. But I can't do this, so please don't ask. It tears at my soul." "Think of all the fun you'll miss," mourned Diana. "We're going to build a new house by the brook, and we'll be playing ball next week. You've never played ball, Anne. It's very exciting. We're going to learn a new song, and Alice Andrews is bringing a new Pansy book next week. We'll read it out loud, chapter by chapter by the brook. You love reading out loud, Anne." Nothing changed Anne's mind. She was determined not to go back to school with Mr. Phillips. She told Marilla when she got home. "Nonsense," said Marilla. "It isn't nonsense at all," said Anne, looking at Marilla with solemn, reproachful eyes. "Don't you understand, Marilla? I've been insulted." "Insulted fiddlesticks. You'll go to school tomorrow as usual." "Oh, no," Anne shook her head gently. "I'm not going back, Marilla. I'll learn my lessons at home and be as good as I can and keep quiet. But I will not go back to school, I promise you." Marilla saw a look of unyielding stubbornness on Anne's small face. She understood that she would have trouble changing Anne's mind, but wisely decided to say nothing more for now. "I'll talk to Rachel about it this evening," she thought. "There's no use reasoning with Anne now. She's too upset, and I have a feeling she can be very stubborn. From what I gather, Mr. Phillips has been rather strict. But it wouldn't do to tell Anne that. I'll just talk it over with Rachel. She sent 10 children to school and should know something about it. She'll have heard the whole story by now." Marilla found Mrs. Lynde knitting quilts as industriously and cheerfully as usual. "I suppose you know what I've come about," she said, a little embarrassed. Mrs. Rachel nodded. "About Anne's fuss in school, I reckon," said Mrs. Lynde. "Tilly Boulter told me about it on her way home." "I don't know what to do with her," said Marilla. "She says she won't go back to school. I've never seen a child so upset. I knew things were going too smoothly to last. She's so high-strung. What would you advise, Rachel?" "Well, since you've asked for my advice," said Mrs. Lynde amiably, loving to be asked for advice, "I'd humor her a little while at first. I think Mr. Phillips was in the wrong. Of course, it doesn't do so to say so to the children. He was right to punish her for her temper, but today was different. The other latecomers should have been punished too, and I don't believe in making girls sit with boys for punishment. It isn't proper." Tilly Boulter was indignant and took Anne's side, as did the other scholars. Anne seems popular among them, surprisingly. "You think I should let her stay at home?" said Marilla in amazement. "Yes. I wouldn't mention school until she brings it up herself. She'll cool off in a week or so and be ready to go back. If you force her now, she might cause more trouble. The less fuss, the better. She won't miss much by not going. Mr. Phillips isn't a good teacher. He neglects the younger students and focuses on those preparing for queens. He wouldn't have gotten the job again if his uncle wasn't a trustee. I don't know what's happening to education on this island." Mrs. Rachel shook her head, as if saying things would be better if she were in charge. Marilla took Mrs. Rachel's advice and didn't mention school to Anne again. Anne learned her lessons at home, did her chores, and played with Diana in the chilly autumn twilights. But when she saw Gilbert Blythe, she ignored him with icy contempt, despite his attempts to make peace. Even Diana couldn't help. Anne seemed determined to hate Gilbert forever. As much as she hated Gilbert, she loved Diana intensely. One evening, Marilla found Anne crying bitterly by the east window. "What's the matter now, Anne?" she asked. "It's about Diana," sobbed Anne. "I love Diana so much, Marilla. I can't live without her. But I know when we grow up, Diana will get married and leave me. I hate her future husband already. I've imagined the wedding. Diana looking beautiful in her dress, and me as the bridesmaid with a breaking heart. Then saying goodbye forever." Anne broke down entirely, crying even harder. Marilla quickly turned away to hide her twitching face, but it was no use. She collapsed into the nearest chair and burst into hearty, unusual laughter. Matthew, crossing the yard outside, stopped in amazement. When had he ever heard Marilla laugh like that before? "Well, Anne Shirley," said Marilla as soon as she could speak, "if you must borrow trouble, for pity's sake borrow it closer to home. You certainly have an imagination." Chapter 16. Diana is invited to tea with tragic results. October was a beautiful month at Green Gables. The birches in the hollow turned as golden as sunshine. The maples behind the orchard were royal crimson, and the wild cherry trees along the lane were dark red and bronzy green. The fields basked in the sunlight. Anne reveled in the world of color around her. "Oh, Marilla," she exclaimed one Saturday morning, dancing with her arms full of colorful branches. "I'm so glad I live in a world where there are Octobers. It would be terrible if we just skipped from September to November, wouldn't it? Look at these maple branches. Don't they give you a thrill? Several thrills? I'm going to decorate my room with them." "Messy things," said Marilla, whose sense of aesthetics was not very developed. "You clutter up your room too much with outdoor stuff, Anne. Bedrooms are made to sleep in." "Oh, and dream in too, Marilla. And you know one can dream better in a room with pretty things. I'm going to put these boughs in the old blue jug and set them on my table. Mind you don't drop leaves all over the stairs. I'm going to a meeting of the Aid Society at Carmody this afternoon, and I won't likely be home before dark. You'll have to get Matthew and Jerry their supper, so don't forget to put the tea to draw until you sit down at the table, like you did last time." "It was dreadful of me to forget," said Anne apologetically, "but that was the afternoon I was trying to think of a name for Violet Vale, and it crowded other things out. Matthew was so good. He never scolded. He put the tea down himself and said we could wait. And I told him a lovely fairy story while we waited, so he didn't mind the time. It was a beautiful fairy story, Marilla. I forget the end of it, so I made one up, and Matthew said he couldn't tell where the join was." "Matthew would think it all right, Anne, if you decided to have dinner in the middle of the night. But keep your wits about you this time. And I don't know if I'm doing right. It may make you more scatterbrained than ever, but you can ask Diana to come over and spend the afternoon with you and have tea here. Oh, Marilla, Anne clasped her hands. How perfectly lovely. You can imagine things after all, or else you'd never have understood how I've longed for that. It will seem so nice and grown up. No fear of my forgetting to put the tea to draw when I have company. Oh, Marilla, can I use the rosebud spray tea set? No, indeed. The rosebud tea set? What next? I never use that except for the minister or the aides. You'll use the old brown tea set, but you can open the little yellow crock of cherry preserves. It's time it was used anyhow. I believe it's starting to go bad. And you can cut some fruit cake and have some cookies and snaps. I can just imagine myself sitting at the head of the table and pouring out the tea, said Anne, closing her eyes ecstatically, and asking Diana if she takes sugar. I know she doesn't, but of course I'll ask her as if I didn't know. And then urging her to take another piece of fruit cake and more preserves. Oh, Marilla, it's just wonderful to think of it. Can I take her into the spare room to lay off her hat when she comes, and then into the parlor to sit? No, the sitting room will do for you and your company, but there's half a bottle of raspberry cordial left over from the church social. It's on the second shelf of the sitting room closet. You and Diana can have it if you like, and a cookie to eat with it in the afternoon, since Matthew will be likely late for tea, as he's hauling potatoes to the vessel. Anne flew down to the hollow, past the Dryad's bubble, and up the spruce path to Orchard Slope to ask Diana to tea. Just after Marilla had driven off to Carmody, Diana came over, dressed in her second best dress, and looking exactly as one should when invited to tea. Usually, she would run into the kitchen without knocking, but now she knocked primly at the front door, when Anne, also dressed in her second best, primly opened it. Both little girls shook hands as if they had never met before. This unnatural formality lasted until Diana had been taken to the east gable to lay off her hat, and then had sat for 10 minutes in the sitting room, toes in position. "How's your mother?" inquired Anne politely, as if she hadn't seen Mrs. Barry picking apples that morning in excellent health and spirits. "She's very well, thank you. I suppose Mr. Cuthbert is hauling potatoes to the lily sands this afternoon, is he?" said Diana, who had ridden down to Mr. Harmon Andrews that morning in Matthew's cart. "Yes, our potato crop is very good this year. I hope your father's crop is good too." "It is fairly good, thank you. Have you picked many of your apples yet?" "Oh, ever so many," said Anne, forgetting to be dignified and jumping up quickly. "Let's go out to the orchard and get some of the red sweetings, Diana. Marilla says we can have all that there are left on the tree. Marilla is a very generous woman. She said we could have fruit cake and cherry preserves for tea, but it isn't good manners to tell your company what you're going to give them to eat, so I won't tell you what she said we could drink. Only it begins with an R and a C, and it's bright red. I love bright red drinks, don't you? They taste twice as good as any other color." The orchard, with its great sweeping boughs heavy with fruit, proved so delightful that the little girl spent most of the afternoon there, sitting in a grassy corner where the frost had spared the green and the warm autumn sunshine lingered. They ate apples and talked as much as they could. Diana had a lot to tell Anne about school. She had to sit with Gertie Pye, and she hated it because Gertie Pye squeaked her pencil all the time, which made Diana's blood run cold. Ruby Gillis had charmed all her warts away with a magic pebble from old Mary Joe at the creek. You had to rub the warts with the pebble, then throw it over your left shoulder at the new moon, and the warts would disappear. Charlie Sloane's name was written up with M. White's on the porch wall, and M. White was furious about it. Sam Bolter, had talked back to Mr. Phillips in class, got whipped, and then Sam's father came to school and dared Mr. Phillips to touch any of his children again. Mattie Andrews had a new red hood and a blue crossover with tassels, and she was showing off terribly. Lizzie White wasn't speaking to Mamie Wilson because Mamie's grown-up sister had stolen Lizzie's sister's boyfriend. Everyone missed Anne and wished she could come back to school. And Gilbert Blythe. But Anne didn't want to hear about Gilbert Blythe. She quickly jumped up and suggested they go inside and have some raspberry cordial. Anne looked on the second shelf of the sitting room pantry, but didn't find the bottle there. After some searching, she found it on the top shelf. She put it on a tray and set it on the table with a tumbler. "Now, please help yourself, Diana," she said politely. "I don't think I'll have any right now. I don't feel like I want any after all those apples." Diana poured herself a tumbler full, admired its bright red color, and then sipped it daintily. "That's awfully nice raspberry cordial, Anne," she said. "I didn't know raspberry cordial was so nice. I'm really glad you like it. Take as much as you want. I'm going to run out and stir the fire. There are so many responsibilities when you're keeping house, aren't there?" When Anne came back from the kitchen, Diana was drinking her second glass of cordial. Encouraged by Anne, she didn't object to drinking a third. The tumblerfuls were generous, and the raspberry cordial was indeed very nice. "The nicest I ever drank," said Diana. "It's so much nicer than Mrs. Lynde's, even though she brags about hers so much. It doesn't taste a bit like hers." "I should think Marilla's raspberry cordial would be much nicer than Mrs. Lynde's," said Anne loyally. "Marilla is a famous cook. She's trying to teach me to cook, but it's uphill work, Diana. There's so little scope for imagination in cookery. You have to follow rules. The last time I made a cake, I forgot to put the flour in. I was thinking of the loveliest story about you and me, Diana. I imagined you were desperately ill with smallpox, and everyone deserted you, but I nursed you back to life. Then I caught smallpox and died, and you planted a rose bush by my grave and watered it with your tears. You never forgot the friend who sacrificed her life for you. It was such a sad tale, Diana. The tears just ran down my cheeks while I mixed the cake. But I forgot the flour, and the cake was a failure. Flour is so essential to cakes. Marilla was very cross, and I don't blame her. I'm a great trial to her. She was very upset about the pudding sauce last week. We had plum pudding for dinner, and there was half the pudding and a pitcher of sauce left. Marilla said there was enough for another dinner, and told me to set it on the pantry shelf and cover it. I meant to cover it, Diana, but I was imagining I was a nun, though I'm Protestant, bearing a broken heart in seclusion, and I forgot all about covering the sauce. The next morning, I found a mouse drowned in the pudding sauce. I lifted it out with a spoon, threw it out, and washed the spoon. I planned to ask Marilla if we should give the sauce to the pigs, but when she came in, I was imagining I was a frost fairy turning the trees red and yellow, so I forgot about the sauce. Marilla sent me to pick apples. Later, Mr. and Mrs. Chester Ross from Spencervale came by. They are very stylish, especially Mrs. Ross. When Marilla called me in for dinner, everything was fine, until I saw Marilla with the pudding and the sauce. Diana, I remembered everything and shouted, "Marilla, you mustn't use that sauce. There was a mouse in it." I'll never forget that awful moment. Mrs. Ross looked at me, and I wanted to sink through the floor. Marilla turned red, but didn't say a word. She took the sauce away and brought in strawberry preserves, She even offered me some, but I couldn't eat a bite. After Mrs. Ross left, Marilla scolded me terribly. "Why, Diana, what's the matter?" Diana stood up unsteadily, then sat down, holding her head. I'm awfully sick," she said thickly. I must go home." "Oh, you can't go without your tea," cried Anne in distress. "I'll get it right away. I'll put the tea down this very minute." "I must go home," repeated Diana stubbornly, but determinedly. "Let me get you a lunch anyhow," implored Anne. "Let me give you a bit of fruitcake and some of the cherry preserves. Lie down on the sofa for a little while and you'll feel better. Where do you feel bad?" "I must go home," said Diana, and that was all she would say. In vain Anne pleaded. "I never heard of company going home without tea," she mourned. "Oh, Diana, do you think it's possible you're really getting smallpox? If you are, I'll go and nurse you. I'll never forsake you. But I do wish you'd stay till after tea. Where do you feel bad?" "I'm awful dizzy," said Diana. And indeed, she walked very dizzily. Anne, with tears of disappointment in her eyes, got Diana's hat and walked with her as far as the Barry yard fence. Then she wept all the way back to Green Gables, where she sorrowfully put the remainder of the raspberry cordial back into the pantry and got tea ready for Matthew and Jerry, with all the zest gone from the task. The next day was Sunday, and as the rain poured down in torrents from dawn till dusk, Anne did not leave Green Gables. On Monday afternoon, Marilla sent her down to Mrs. Lynde's on an errand. In a very short time, Anne came flying back up the lane with tears streaming down her cheeks. She dashed into the kitchen and flung herself face down on the sofa in agony. "Whatever's gone wrong now, Anne?" queried Marilla in doubt and dismay. "I do hope you haven't been saucy to Mrs. Lynde again." No answer from Anne except more tears and stormier sobs. "Anne Shirley, when I ask you a question, I want to be answered. Sit up this minute and tell me what you're crying about." Anne sat up, looking tragic. "Mrs. Lynde was up to see Mrs. Barry today, and Mrs. Barry was in an awful state," she wailed. "She says that I got Diana drunk on Saturday and sent her home in a disgraceful condition. She says I must be a thoroughly bad, wicked girl, and she's never going to let Diana play with me again. Oh, Marilla, I'm just overcome with woe." Marilla stared in blank amazement. "Got Diana drunk," she said when she found her voice. "Anne, are you or Mrs. Barry going crazy? What on earth did you give her?" "Nothing but raspberry cordial," sobbed Anne. "I never thought raspberry cordial would make people drunk, Marilla. Not even if they drank 3 big tumblerfuls like Diana did. Oh, it sounds so like Mrs. Thomas's husband, but I didn't mean to get her drunk." "Drunk fiddlesticks," said Marilla, marching to the sitting room pantry. There on the shelf was a bottle she recognized as one containing her 3-year-old homemade currant wine, for which she was famous in Avonlea, though certain strict people, Mrs. Barry among them, disapproved of it. At the same time, Marilla remembered that she had put the bottle of raspberry cordial in the cellar instead of in the pantry as she had told Anne. She went back to the kitchen with the wine bottle in her hand, her face twitching in spite of herself. "Anne, you certainly have a genius for getting into trouble. You gave Diana currant wine instead of raspberry cordial. Didn't you know the difference yourself?" "I never tasted it," said Anne. "I thought it was the cordial. I meant to be hospitable. Diana got awfully sick and had to go home. Mrs. Barry told Mrs. Lynde she was dead drunk. Diana just laughed silly-like when her mother asked what was the matter and went to sleep for hours. Her mother smelled her breath and knew she was drunk. She had a terrible headache all day yesterday. Mrs. Barry is so angry. She'll never believe I didn't do it on purpose. I should think she should better punish Diana for being so greedy as to drink 3 glassfuls of anything, said Marilla shortly. Why, 3 of those big glasses would have made her sick even if it had only been cordial. Well, this story will be a nice handle for those folks who are so down on me for making currant wine, although I haven't made any for 3 years ever since I found out that the minister didn't approve. I just kept that bottle for sickness. There, child, don't cry. I can't see as you were to blame, although I'm sorry it happened so. I must cry, said Anne. My heart is broken. The stars in their courses fight against me, Marilla. Diana and I are parted forever. Oh, Marilla, I little dreamed of this when we first swore our vows of friendship. Don't be foolish, Anne. Mrs. Barry will think better of it when she finds you're not to blame. I suppose she thinks you did it for a silly joke or something like that. You'd best go up this evening and tell her how it was. My courage fails me at the thought of facing Diana's injured mother, sighed Anne. I'd wish you'd go, Marilla. You're so much more dignified than I am. Likely she'd listen to you quicker to me. Well, I will, said Marilla, reflecting that it would probably be the wiser course. Don't cry any more, Anne. It will be all right. Marilla had changed her mind about it being all right by the time she got back from Orchard Slope. Anne was watching for her and flew to the porch door to meet her. Oh, Marilla, I know by your face that it's been no use, she said sorrowfully. Mrs. Barry won't forgive me? Mrs. Barry, indeed, snapped Marilla. Of all the unreasonable women I ever saw, she's the worst. I told her it was all a mistake and you weren't to blame, but she didn't believe me, and she rubbed it in well about my currant wine and how I'd always said it couldn't have the least effect on anybody. I just told her plainly that currant wine wasn't meant to be drunk 3 tumblerfuls at a time, and that if a child I had to do with was so greedy, I'd sober her up with a good spanking. Marilla whisked into the kitchen, grievously disturbed, leaving a very distracted little soul in the porch behind her. Presently, Anne stepped out, bareheaded, into the chill autumn dusk. Determinedly and steadily, she made her way down through the clover field, over the log bridge, and up through the spruce grove, lit by a pale little moon hanging low over the western woods. Mrs. Barry, coming to the door in answer to a timid knock, found a white-lipped, eager-eyed Anne on the doorstep. Her face hardened. Mrs. Barry was a woman of strong prejudices and dislikes, and her anger was the cold, sullen kind, which is always hardest to overcome. To be fair, she genuinely believed Anne had made Diana drunk out of sheer malice, and she was honestly anxious to protect her daughter from further contact with such a child. "What do you want?" she said stiffly. Anne clasped her hands. "Oh, Mrs. Barry, please forgive me. I didn't mean to intoxicate Diana. How could I? Just imagine if you were a poor little orphan girl that kind people had adopted, and you had just one best friend in all the world. Do you think you would make her drunk on purpose? I thought it was only raspberry cordial. I was convinced it was raspberry cordial. Oh, please don't say you won't let Diana play with me anymore. If you do, you will cover my life with a dark cloud of woe." This speech, which would have softened good Mrs. Lynde's heart in a twinkling, had no effect on Mrs. Barry except to irritate her more. She was suspicious of Anne's big words and dramatic gestures and thought the child was mocking her. So she said coldly and cruelly, "I don't think you're a fit little girl for Diana to associate with. You'd better go home and behave yourself." Anne's lips quivered. "Won't you let me see Diana just once to say goodbye?" she implored. "Diana has gone over to Carmody with her father," said Mrs. Barry, going in and shutting the door. Anne went back to Green Gables, calm with despair. "My last hope is gone," she told Marilla. "I went up and saw Mrs. Barry myself, and she treated me very insultingly, Marilla. I do not think she's a well-bred woman. There is nothing more to do except pray, and I haven't much hope that will help, because, Marilla, I don't believe that God himself can do much with such an obstinate person as Mrs. Barry." "Anne, you shouldn't say such things," rebuked Marilla, striving to overcome the urge to laugh, which she was dismayed to find growing upon her. And indeed, when she told the whole story to Matthew that night, she laughed heartily over Anne's tribulations. But when she slipped into the east gable before going to bed, and found that Anne had cried herself to sleep, an unaccustomed softness crept into her face. "Poor little soul," she murmured, lifting a loose curl of hair from the child's tear-stained face. Then she bent down and kissed the flushed cheek on the pillow. Chapter 17. A New Interest in Life. The next afternoon, Anne was bending over her patchwork at the kitchen window when she happened to glance outside and saw Diana down by the Dryad's bubble, beckoning mysteriously. In a flash, Anne was out of the house and flying down to the hollow, her expressive eyes filled with astonishment and hope. But the hope faded when she saw Diana's dejected expression. "Your mother hasn't relented?" she gasped. Diana shook her head mournfully. "No, and oh, Anne, she says I'm never to play with you again. I've cried and told her it wasn't your fault, but it wasn't any use. I had a hard time convincing her to let me come down and say goodbye to you. She said I can only stay 10 minutes, and she's timing me by the clock." 10 minutes isn't very long to say an eternal farewell," said Anne tearfully. "Oh, Diana, will you promise faithfully never to forget me, the friend of your youth, no matter what dearer friends may caress thee?" "Indeed I will," sobbed Diana, "and I'll never have another bosom friend. I don't want to have one. I couldn't love anybody as I love you." "Oh, Diana," cried Anne, clasping her hands, "do you love me?" "Why, of course I do. Didn't you know that?" "No," Anne drew a long breath. "I thought you liked me, but I never hoped you loved me. Why, Diana, I didn't think anybody could love me. Nobody has ever loved me since I can remember. Oh, this is wonderful. It's a ray of light that will forever shine on the darkness of a path severed from thee, Diana. Oh, just say it once again." "I love you devotedly, Anne," said Diana staunchly, "and I always will. You may be sure of that." "And I will always love thee, Diana," said Anne, solemnly extending her hand. "In the years to come, thy memory will shine like a star over my lonely life, as that last story we read together. Diana, wilt thou give me a lock of thy jet-black tresses in parting to treasure forevermore?" "Have you got anything to cut it with?" asked Diana, wiping away the tears that Anne's affecting words had caused to flow afresh. "Yes, I've got my patchwork scissors in my apron pocket, fortunately, said Anne. She solemnly clipped one of Diana's curls. Fare thee well, my beloved friend. Henceforth we must be strangers, though living side by side, but my heart will ever be faithful to thee. Anne stood and watched Diana out of sight, mournfully waving her hand to her whenever she turned to look back. Then she returned to the house, somewhat consoled by this romantic parting. It is all over, she informed Marilla. I shall never have another friend. I'm worse off than ever before, for I haven't Katie Maurice and Violetta now, and even if I did, it wouldn't be the same. Somehow, little dream girls are not satisfying after a real friend. Diana and I had such an affecting farewell down by the spring. It will be sacred in my memory forever. I used the most pathetic language I could think of and said thou and thee. Thou and thee seem so much more romantic than you. Diana gave me a lock of her hair, and I'm going to sew it up in a little bag and wear it around my neck all my life. Please see that it is buried with me, for I don't believe I'll live very long. Perhaps when she sees me lying cold and dead before her, Mrs. Barry may feel remorse for what she has done, and will let Diana come to my funeral. I don't think there's much fear of you dying of grief as long as you can talk, Anne, said Marilla unsympathetically. The following Monday, Anne surprised Marilla by coming down from her room with a basket of books on her arm, and her lips primmed up in determination. I'm going back to school, she announced. That is all that is left in life for me, now that my friend has been ruthlessly torn from me. In school, I can look at her and muse over days departed. You'd better muse over your lessons and sums, said Marilla, hiding her delight at this development. If you're going back to school, I hope we'll hear no more of breaking slates over people's heads and such carryings on. Behave yourself and do just what your teacher tells you. I'll try to be a model pupil, agreed Anne dolefully. There won't be much fun in it, I expect. Mr. Phillips said Minnie Andrews was a model pupil, and there isn't a spark of imagination or life in her. She is just dull and poky and never seems to have a good time. But I feel so depressed that perhaps it will come easy to me now. I'm going around by the road. I couldn't bear to go by the birch path all alone. I should weep bitter tears if I did. Anne was welcomed back to school with open arms. Her imagination had been sorely missed in her games. Her voice in singing, and her dramatic ability in reading books aloud during dinner hour. Ruby Gillis smuggled 3 blue plums to her during Testament reading. Ella May McPherson gave her an enormous yellow pansy cut from the covers of a floral catalogue, a prized desk decoration in Avonlea School. Sophia Sloane offered to teach her an elegant new pattern of knit lace, perfect for trimming aprons. Katie Bolter gave her a perfume bottle to keep slate water in, and Julia Bell carefully copied on a piece of pale pink paper, scalloped on the edges, the following effusion. To Anne. When twilight drops her curtain down and pins it with a star, remember that you have a friend, though she may wander far. It's so nice to be appreciated, sighed Anne rapturously to Marilla that night. The girls were not the only ones who appreciated her. When Anne went to her seat after dinner hour, she had been told by Mr. Phillips to sit with the model Minnie Andrews. She found on her desk a big, luscious strawberry apple. Anne picked it up, ready to take a bite, when she remembered that the only place in Avonlea where strawberry apples grew was in the old Blythe orchard on the other side of the Lake of Shining Waters. Anne dropped the apple as if it were a red-hot coal and ostentatiously wiped her fingers on her handkerchief. The apple lay untouched on her desk until the next morning, when little Timothy Andrews, who swept the school and kindled the fire, took it as one of his perks. Charlie Sloane's slate pencil, decorated with striped red and yellow paper, costing 2 cents where ordinary pencils cost only 1, which he sent to her after dinner hour, met with a more favorable reception. Anne graciously accepted it and rewarded the donor with a smile, and caused him to make such fearful errors in his dictation that Mr. Phillips kept him after school to rewrite it. "Diana might just have smiled at me once, I think," she mourned to Marilla that night. But the next morning, a note most fearfully and wonderfully twisted and folded, and a small parcel were passed across to Anne. "Dear Anne," ran the note, "Mother says I'm not to play with you or talk to you even in school. It isn't my fault, and don't be cross at me, because I love you as much as ever. I miss you awfully to tell all my secrets to, and I don't like Gertie Pye one bit. I made you one of the new bookmarkers out of red tissue paper. They are awfully fashionable now, and only 3 girls in school know how to make them. When you look at it, remember your true friend, Diana Barry." Anne read the note, kissed the bookmark, and promptly replied, "My own darling Diana, of course, I'm not cross at you because you have to obey your mother. Our spirits can commune. I shall keep your lovely present forever. Minnie Andrews is a very nice little girl, although she has no imagination, but after having been Diana's bosom friend, I cannot be Minnie's. Please excuse mistakes, because my spelling isn't very good yet, although much improved. Yours until death us do part, Anne or Cordelia Shirley. P.S. I shall sleep with your letter under my pillow tonight." Marilla pessimistically expected more trouble since Anne had begun going to school again, but none developed. Perhaps Anne caught something of the model spirit from Minnie Andrews. At least she got on well with Mr. Phillips thenceforth. She flung herself into her studies heart and soul, determined not to be outdone in any class by Gilbert Blythe. The rivalry between them was soon apparent. It was entirely good-natured on Gilbert's side, but it is much to be feared that the same thing cannot be said of Anne, who certainly had an unpraiseworthy tenacity for holding grudges. She was as intense in her hatreds as in her loves. She would not stoop to admit that she meant to rival Gilbert in schoolwork, because that would have been to acknowledge his existence, which Anne persistently ignored. But the rivalry was there, and honors fluctuated between them. Now Gilbert was head of the spelling class. Now Anne, with a toss of her long red braids, spelled him down. One morning, Gilbert had all his sums correct, and his name written on the blackboard roll of honor. The next morning, Anne, having wrestled wildly with decimals the entire evening before, was first. One awful day they were ties, and their names were written up together. It was almost as bad as a take notice, and Anne's mortification was evident as Gilbert's satisfaction. When the written examinations at the end of each month were held, the suspense was terrible. The first month, Gilbert came out 3 marks ahead. The second, Anne beat him by 5, but her triumph was marred by the fact that Gilbert congratulated her heartily before the whole school. It would have been ever so much sweeter if he had felt the sting of his defeat. Mr. Phillips might not be a very good teacher, but a pupil as inflexibly determined on learning as Anne could hardly escape making progress under any kind of teacher. By the end of the term, Anne and Gilbert were both promoted to the 5th class, and allowed to begin studying the elements of the branches: Latin, geometry, French, and algebra. In geometry, Anne met her Waterloo. "It's perfectly awful stuff, Marilla," she groaned. "I'm sure I'll never be able to make head or tail of it. There is no scope for imagination in it at all. Mr. Phillips says I'm the worst dunce he ever saw at it, and some of the others are so smart at it. It is extremely mortifying, Marilla. Even Diana gets along better than I do. But I don't mind being beaten by Diana, even though we meet as strangers now. I still love her, with an inextinguishable love. It makes me very sad at times to think about her. But really, Marilla, one can't stay sad very long, can they?" Chapter 18. Anne to the Rescue. All things great are wound up with all things little. At first glance, it might not seem that the decision of a certain Canadian premier to include Prince Edward Island in a political tour could have much or anything to do with the fortunes of little Anne Shirley at Green Gables. But it had. It was in January the premier came to address his loyal supporters and such of his non-supporters as chose to be present at the monster mass meeting held in Charlottetown. Most of the Avonlea people were on Premier's side of politics. Hence, on the night of the meeting, nearly all the men and a goodly proportion of the women had gone to town 30 miles away. Mrs. Rachel Lynde had gone too. Mrs. Rachel Lynde was a red-hot politician and couldn't have believed that the political rally could be carried through without her, although she was on the opposite side of politics. So she went to town and took her husband Thomas, who would be useful in looking after the horse, and Marilla Cuthbert with her. Marilla had a sneaking interest in politics herself, and as she thought it might be her only chance to see a real-life premier, she promptly took it, leaving Anne and Matthew to keep house until her return the following day. Hence, while Marilla and Mrs. Rachel were enjoying themselves hugely at the mass meeting, Anne and Matthew had the cheerful kitchen at Green Gables all to themselves. A bright fire was glowing in the old-fashioned Waterloo stove, and blue-white frost crystals were shining on the window panes. Matthew nodded over a farmer's advocate on the sofa, and Anne at the table studied her lessons with grim determination, despite sundry wistful glances at the clock shelf, where lay a new book that Jane Andrews had lent her that day. Jane had assured her that it was warranted to produce any number of thrills, or words to that effect, and Anne's fingers tingled to reach out for it. But that would mean Gilbert Blythe's triumph on the morrow. Anne turned her back on the clock shelf and tried to imagine it wasn't there. "Matthew, did you ever study geometry when you went to school?" "Well now, no, I didn't," said Matthew, coming out of his doze with a start. "I wish you had," sighed Anne, "because then you'd be able to sympathize with me. You can't sympathize properly if you've never studied it. It is casting a cloud over my whole life. I'm such a dunce at it, Matthew." "Well now, I don't know," said Matthew soothingly. "I guess you're all right at anything. Mr. Phillips told me last week in Blair's store at Carmody that you was the smartest scholar in school and was making rapid progress. Rapid progress was his very words. There's them as runs down Teddy Phillips and says he ain't much of a teacher, but I guess he's all right." Matthew would have thought anyone who praised Anne was all right. "I'm sure I'd get on better with geometry if only he wouldn't change the letters," complained Anne. "I learn the proposition off by heart, and then he draws it on the blackboard and puts different letters from what are in the book, and I get all mixed up. I don't think a teacher should take such a mean advantage, do you? We're studying agriculture now, and I found out at last what makes the roads red. It's a great comfort. I wonder how Marilla and Mrs. Lynde are enjoying themselves. Mrs. Lynde says Canada is going to the dogs the way things are being run at Ottawa, and that it's an awful warning to the electors. She says if women were allowed to vote, we would soon see a blessed change. What way do you vote, Matthew? Conservative, said Matthew promptly. To vote Conservative was part of Matthew's religion. Then I'm Conservative too, said Anne decidedly. I'm glad because some of the boys in school are grits. I guess Mr. Phillips is a grit too because Percy Andrews' father is one. And Ruby Gillis says that when a man is courting, he always has to agree with the girl's mother in religion and her father in politics. Is that true, Matthew? Well now, I don't know, said Matthew. Did you ever go courting, Matthew? Well now, no, I don't know I ever did, said Matthew, who had certainly never thought of such a thing in his whole existence. Anne reflected with her chin in her hands. It must be rather interesting, don't you think, Matthew? Ruby Gillis says when she grows up, she's going to have ever so many bows on the string and have them all crazy about her. But I think that would be too exciting. I'd rather have just one in his right mind. But Ruby Gillis knows a great deal about such matters because she has so many big sisters. And Mrs. Lynde says the Gillis girls have gone off like hotcakes. Mr. Phillips goes up to see Percy Andrews nearly every evening. He says it is to help her with her lessons, but Miranda Sloane is studying for Queen's too, and I should think she needed help a lot more than Percy, because she's ever so much stupider, but he never goes to help her in the evenings at all. There are a great many things in this world that I can't understand very well, Matthew. Well now, I don't know as I comprehend them all myself, acknowledged Matthew. Well, I suppose I must finish up my lessons. I won't allow myself to open that new book Jane lent me until I'm through, but it's a terrible temptation, Matthew. Even when I turn my back on it, I can see it there just as plain. Jane said she cried herself sick over it. I love a book that makes me cry. But I think I'll carry that book in the sitting room and lock it in the jam closet and give you the key. And you must not give it to me, Matthew, until my lessons are done, not even if I implore you on my bended knees. It's all very well to say resist temptation, but it's ever so much easier to resist it if you can't get the key. And then shall I run down the cellar and get some russets, Matthew? Wouldn't you like some russets? Well now, I don't know but what I would, said Matthew, who never ate russets, but knew Anne's weakness for them. Just as Anne emerged triumphantly from the cellar, with her plate full of russets, came the sound of flying footsteps on the icy boardwalk outside, and the next moment the kitchen door was flung open, and in rushed Diana Barry, white-faced and breathless, with a shawl wrapped hastily around her head. Anne promptly let go of her candle and plate in her surprise, and plate, candle, and apples crashed down together down the cellar ladder, and were found at the bottom embedded in melted grease the next day by Marilla, who gathered them up and thanked mercy the house hadn't been set on fire. Whatever is the matter, Diana? Cried Anne. Has your mother relented at last? Oh, Anne, do come quick, implored Diana nervously. Minnie May is awful sick. She's got croup, young Mary Joe says, and father and mother are away to town, and there's nobody to go for doctor. Minnie May is awful bad, and young Mary Joe doesn't know what to do. And oh, Anne, I'm so scared. Matthew, without a word, reached out for cap and coat, slipped past Diana, and away into the darkness of the yard. He's gone to harness the sorrel mare to go to Carmody for the doctor, said Anne, who was hurrying on hood and jacket. I know it as well as if he had said so. Matthew and I are such kindred spirits. I can read his thoughts without words at all. I don't believe he'll find the doctor at Carmody, sobbed Diana. I know that Dr. Blair went to town, and I guess Dr. Spencer would go too. Young Mary Jo never saw anybody with croup, and Mrs. Linda's away. Oh, Anne. Don't cry, Di, said Anne cheerily. I know exactly what to do for croup. You forget that Mrs. Hammond had twins 3 times. When you look after 3 pairs of twins, you naturally get a lot of experience. They all had croup regularly. Just wait till I get the ipecac bottle. You may not have any at your house. Come on now. The 2 little girls hastened out hand in hand and hurried through Lover's Lane across the crusted field beyond, for the snow was too deep to go by the shorter wood way. Anne, although sincerely sorry for Minnie May, was far from being insensible to the romance of the situation and to the sweetness of once more sharing the romance with a kindred spirit. The night was clear and frosty, all ebony of shadow and silver of snowy slope. Big stars were shining over the silent fields. Here and there the dark-pointed firs stood up, with snow powdering their branches and the wind whistling through them. Anne thought it was truly delightful to go skimming through all this mystery and loveliness with your bosom friend who had been so long estranged. Minnie May, age 3, was really very sick. She lay on the kitchen sofa, feverish and restless, while her hoarse breathing could be heard all over the house. Young Mary Jo, a buxom, broad-faced French girl from the creek, who Mrs. Barry had engaged to stay with the children during her absence, was helpless and bewildered, quite incapable of thinking what to do, or doing it if she thought of it. Anne went to work with skill and promptness. Minnie May has croup all right. She's pretty bad, but I've seen them worse. First, we must have lots of hot water. I declare, Diana, there isn't more than a cupful in the kettle. There, I filled it up, and, Mary Jo, you may put some wood in the stove. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but it seems to me you might have thought of this before if you had any imagination. Now, I'll undress Minnie May and put her to bed, and you try to find some soft flannel cloths, Diana. I'm going to give her a dose of the ipecac first of all. Minnie May did not take kindly to the ipecac, but Anne had not brought up 3 pairs of twins for nothing. Down that ipecac went, not only once, but many times during the long, anxious night when the 2 little girls worked patiently over the suffering Minnie May, and young Mary Jo, honestly anxious to do all she could, kept up a roaring fire and heated more water than would have been needed for a hospital of croupy babies. It was 3 o'clock when Matthew came with a doctor, for he had been obliged to go all the way to Spencervale for one. But the pressing need for assistance was past. Minnie May was much better and was sleeping soundly. I was awfully near giving up in despair, explained Anne. She got worse and worse until she was sicker than ever the Hammond twins were, even the last pair. I actually thought she was going to choke to death. I gave her every drop of the ipecac in that bottle, and when the last dose went down, I said to myself, not to Diana or young Mary Jo, because I didn't want to worry them any more than they were worried, but I had to say it to myself just to relieve my feelings. This is the last lingering hope, and I fear 'tis a vain one. But in about 3 minutes, she coughed up the phlegm and began to get better right away. You must just imagine my relief, Doctor, because I can't express it in words. You know there are some things that cannot be expressed in words. Yes, I know, nodded the doctor. He looked at Anne as if he were thinking some things about her that couldn't be expressed in words. Later on, however, he expressed them to Mr. and Mrs. Barry. That little red-headed girl they have over at the Cuthberts is as smart as they make 'em. I tell you, she saved that baby's life for it would have been too late by the time I got there. She seems to have a skill and presence of mind perfectly wonderful in a child of her age. I never saw anything like the eyes of her when she was explaining the case to me." Anne had gone home in the wonderful white frosted winter morning, heavy-eyed from loss of sleep, but still talking unweariedly to Matthew as they crossed the long white field and walked under the glittering fairy arch of the Lover's Lane maples. "Oh, Matthew, isn't it a wonderful morning? The world looks like something God had just imagined for his own pleasure, doesn't it? Those trees look as if I could blow them away with a breath. Poof! I'm so glad I live in a world where there are white frosts, aren't you? And I'm so glad Mrs. Hammond had 3 pairs of twins after all. If she hadn't, I mightn't have known what to do for Minnie May. I'm really sorry I was ever cross with Mrs. Hammond for having twins. But oh, Matthew, I'm so sleepy. I can't go to school. I just know I couldn't keep my eyes open, and I'd be so stupid. But I hate to stay home, for some of the others will get ahead of the class, and it's so hard to get up again. Although, of course, the harder it is, the more satisfaction you have when you do get up, haven't you?" "Well now, I guess you'll manage all right," said Matthew, looking at Anne's white little face and the dark shadows under her eyes. "You just go right to bed and have a good sleep. I'll do all the chores." Anne accordingly went to bed and slept so long and soundly that it was well on in the white and rosy winter afternoon when she awoke and descended to the kitchen, where Marilla, who had arrived home in the meantime, was sitting knitting. "Oh, did you see the Premier?" exclaimed Anne at once. "What did he look like, Marilla?" "Well, he never got to be Premier on account of his looks," said Marilla. "Such a nose as that man had. But he can speak. I was proud of being conservative. Rachel Lynde, of course, being a liberal, had no use for him. Your dinner's in the oven, Anne, and you can get yourself some blue plum preserve out of the pantry. I guess you're hungry. Matthew has been telling me about last night. I must say, it was fortunate you knew what to do. I wouldn't have had any idea myself, for I never saw a case of croup. There now, never mind talking till you've had your dinner. I can tell by the look of you that you're just full up with speeches, but they'll keep." Marilla had something to tell Anne, but she did not tell it just then, for she knew if she did, Anne's consequent excitement would lift her clear out of the region of such material matters as appetite or dinner. Not until Anne had finished her saucer of blue plums did Marilla say, "Mrs. Barry was here this afternoon, Anne. She wanted to see you, but I wouldn't wake you up. She says you saved Minnie May's life, and she's very sorry she acted as she did in that affair of the currant wine. She says she knows now you didn't mean to set Diana drunk, and she hopes you'll forgive her and be good friends with Diana again. You're to go over this evening if you like, for Diana can't stir outside the door on account of a bad cold she caught last night. Now, Anne Shirley, for pity's sake, don't fly up into the air." The warning seemed not unnecessary. So uplifted and aerial was Anne's expression and attitude as she sprang to her feet, her face irradiated with the flame of her spirit. "Oh, Marilla, can I go right now without washing my dishes? I'll wash them when I come back, but I cannot tie myself down to anything so unromantic as dishwashing at this thrilling moment." Yes, run along," said Marilla indulgently. "Anne Shirley, are you crazy? Come back this instant and put something on you. I might as well call to the wind. She's gone without a cap or wrap. Look at her tearing through the orchard with her hair streaming. It'll be a mercy if she doesn't catch her death of cold." Anne came dancing home in the purple winter twilight across the snowy places. Afar in the southwest was the great shimmering, pearl-like sparkle of an evening star in a sky over gleaming white spaces and dark glens of spruce. The tinkles of sleigh bells among the snowy hills came like elfin chimes through the frosty air, but their music was not sweeter than the song in Anne's heart and on her lips. "You see, before you are a perfectly happy person, Marilla," she announced. "I'm perfectly happy, yes, in spite of my red hair. Just at present, I have a soul above red hair. Mrs. Barry kissed me and cried and said she was so sorry and she could never repay me. I felt fearfully embarrassed, Marilla, but I just said as politely as I could, 'I have no hard feelings for you, Mrs. Barry. I assure you once and for all that I did not mean to intoxicate Diana, and henceforth I shall cover the past with the mantle of oblivion.' That was a pretty dignified way of speaking, wasn't it, Marilla? I felt that I was heaping coals of fire on Mrs. Barry's head, and Diana and I had a lovely afternoon. Diana gave me a beautiful card with a wreath of roses on it and a verse of poetry. 'If you love me as I love you, nothing but death can part us two.' And that is true, Marilla. We're going to ask Mr. Phillips to let us sit together in school again, and Gertie Pye can go with Minnie Andrews. We had an elegant tea. Mrs. Barry had the very best china set out, Marilla, just as if I was real company. I can't tell you what a thrill it gave me. Nobody ever used their very best china on my account before. And we had fruit cake and pound cake and donuts and 2 kinds of preserves, Marilla. And Mrs. Barry asked me if I took tea and said, 'Pa, why don't you pass the biscuits to Anne?' It must be lovely to be grown up, Marilla, when just being treated as if you were is so nice." "I don't know about that," said Marilla with a brief sigh. "Well, anyway, when I'm grown up," said Anne decidedly, "I'm always going to talk to little girls as if they were too, and I'll never laugh when they use big words. I know from sorrowful experience how that hurts one's feelings." After tea, Diana and I made taffy. The taffy wasn't very good, I suppose because neither Diana nor I had ever made any before. Diana left me to stir it while she buttered the plates, and I forgot and let it burn. And then when we set it out on the platform to cool, the cat walked over one plate, and that had to be thrown away. But the making of it was splendid fun. Then, when I came home, Mrs. Barry asked me to come over as often as I could, and Diana stood at the window and threw kisses to me all the way down to Lover's Lane. I assure you, Marilla, that I feel like praying tonight, and I'm going to think out a special brand new prayer in honor of the occasion. Chapter 19. A Concert, a Catastrophe, and a Confession. "Marilla, can I go over to see Diana for a minute?" asked Anne, running breathlessly downstairs one February evening. "I don't see why you need to be out after dark," said Marilla shortly. "You and Diana walked home from school together, and then stood outside in the snow talking for half an hour more. So I don't think you're desperate to see her again." "But she wants to see me," pleaded Anne. "She has something very important to tell me." "How do you know?" "Because she just signaled to me from her window. We have a way to signal with candles and cardboard. We set the candle on the windowsill and make flashes by passing the cardboard back and forth. Each number of flashes means something different. It was my idea, Marilla." "I bet," said Marilla. "And the next thing, you'll be setting the curtains on fire with your signaling nonsense." "Oh, we're very careful, Marilla. It's so interesting. 2 flashes mean, 'Are you there?' 3 mean, 'Yes,' and 4 mean, 'No.' 5 flashes mean, 'Come over as soon as possible, because I have something important to tell you.' Diana just signaled 5 flashes, and I'm dying to know what it is." "Well, You don't have to suffer any longer, said Marilla sarcastically. You can go, but be back here in 10 minutes, remember that. Anne did remember, and returned on time, though it was hard for her to keep the conversation with Diana within 10 minutes, but she made good use of the time. Oh, Marilla, guess what? Tomorrow is Diana's birthday, and her mother said I could go home with her after school and stay all night. Her cousins are coming from Newbridge in a big sleigh to take us to the debating club concert at the hall tomorrow night. They'll take Diana and me if you'll let me go. Please, Marilla, can I go? I'm so excited. You can calm down because you're not going. You're better off at home in your own bed. Little girls shouldn't be out at such events. I'm sure the debating club is respectable, pleaded Anne. I'm not saying it isn't, but you're not going to start going to concerts and staying out late at night. I'm surprised Mrs. Barry is letting Diana go. But it's a special occasion, Anne said, nearly in tears. Diana has only one birthday a year. It's not like birthdays are common. Prissy Andrews is going to recite, "Curfew must not ring tonight." That's a good moral piece, Marilla. It would do me good to hear it. And the choir is going to sing 4 beautiful songs, almost as good as hymns. And Marilla, the minister is going to give an address. That's almost like a sermon. Please, can I go? You heard what I said, Anne. Take off your boots and go to bed. It's past 8. There's one more thing, Marilla, said Anne, hoping for a last chance. Mrs. Barry said, Diana and I could sleep in the spare room bed. Think of the honor of your little Anne being put in the spare room bed. It's an honor you'll have to miss. Go to bed, Anne, and don't say another word. When Anne, with tears in her eyes, had gone sorrowfully upstairs, Matthew, who seemed to have been sleeping on the lounge, opened his eyes and said firmly, Well now, Marilla, I think you ought to let Anne go. I don't think so, replied Marilla. Who's bringing up this child, Matthew, you or me? Well now, you, admitted Matthew. Then don't interfere. I'm not interfering. It's not interfering to have an opinion, and my opinion is that you should let Anne go. You think I should let Anne go to the moon if she wanted to, I bet, Marilla replied. I might have let her spend the night with Diana, but I don't approve of this concert plan. She might catch a cold or get too excited. It would unsettle her for a week. I understand what's good for her better than you do, Matthew. I still think you should let Anne go, repeated Matthew firmly. He wasn't good at arguing, but he was good at sticking to his opinion. Marilla sighed and remained silent. The next morning, as Anne was washing breakfast dishes, Matthew paused on his way to the barn to say to Marilla again, I think you should let Anne go, Marilla. Marilla gave him a frustrated look, but finally said, Fine, she can go, since nothing else will make you happy. Anne rushed out of the pantry, still holding a wet dishcloth. Oh, Marilla, Marilla, say those wonderful words again. Once is enough. This is Matthew's doing, and I wash my hands of it. If you catch pneumonia sleeping in a strange bed, or get sick coming out of the hot hall, don't blame me, blame Matthew. Anne Shirley, you're dripping water all over the floor. I never saw such a careless child. I know I'm a big trial to you, Marilla, said Anne apologetically. I make so many mistakes, but think of all the mistakes I don't make. I'll clean up the floor before I go to school. Oh, Marilla, my heart was set on going to that concert. I've never been to a concert, and when the other girls talk about them, I feel left out. You didn't know how I felt, but Matthew did. Matthew understands me, and it's nice to be understood. Anne was too excited to focus on her lessons that morning. Gilbert Blythe beat her in a spelling competition and mental arithmetic. Anne was less upset than usual because of the concert, and the spare room bed. She and Diana talked about it all day, and with a stricter teacher than Mr. Phillips, they might have gotten into trouble. The real excitement began when school was dismissed and continued to build until the concert itself. They had a lovely tea, then dressed up in Diana's room. Diana styled Anne's hair in a new pompadour fashion, and Anne tied Diana's bows. They tried different ways of arranging their back hair before they were ready, with cheeks flushed and eyes sparkling. Anne felt a little pang when she compared her plain black hat and homemade gray coat to Diana's stylish fur cap and jacket, but she remembered she had an imagination and could use it. Diana's cousins, the Murrays from Newbridge, arrived. They all piled into the big sleigh, surrounded by straw and fur robes. Anne enjoyed the ride to the hall, gliding over the smooth roads with snow crunching under the runners. The sunset was magnificent, and the snowy hills and deep blue water of the St. Lawrence Gulf looked like a huge bowl of pearl and sapphire filled with wine and fire. Sleigh bells and distant laughter added to the magical atmosphere. "Oh, Diana," whispered Anne, squeezing Diana's mittened hand. "Isn't it all like a beautiful dream? Do I look the same as usual? I feel so different that it must show." "You look lovely," said Diana, who had just received a compliment from one of her cousins and felt she should pass it on. "You have the prettiest color." The program was thrilling for Anne. When Prissy Andrews, in a new pink silk blouse with a string of pearls and real carnations in her hair, rumored to have been sent by the teacher from town, recited a dramatic poem, Anne shivered in sympathy. When the choir sang, "Far Above the Gentle Daisies," Anne gazed at the ceiling as if it were painted with angels. When Sam Sloane told a funny story, Anne laughed so hard that others around her laughed too, just from watching her. And when Mr. Phillips gave a stirring recitation of Mark Antony's speech over Caesar's body, looking at Prissy Andrews with each line, Anne felt ready to join a mutiny. The only part of the program that didn't interest her was when Gilbert Blythe recited Bingen on the Rhine. Anne picked up Rhoda Murray's library book and read it until he finished. She sat stiffly, while Diana clapped her hands enthusiastically. It was 11 o'clock when they got home, still buzzing with excitement and eager to talk about the evening. The house was dark and quiet. Anne and Diana tiptoed into the parlor, a long, narrow room next to the spare room. It was warm and dimly lit by the fire's embers. "Let's undress here," said Diana. "It's so warm." "Hasn't it been a wonderful time?" sighed Anne happily. "It must be amazing to recite on stage. Do you think we'll ever get to do it, Diana?" "Yes, of course. They always want the older students to recite. Gilbert Blythe does often, and he's only 2 years older than us. Oh, Anne, how could you pretend not to listen to him? When he said, 'There's another, not a sister,' he looked right at you." "Diana," said Anne with dignity, "you're my best friend, but I can't let you talk to me about that person. Are you ready for bed? Let's race to see who gets to bed first." Diana liked the idea. The two little girls, dressed in their nightgowns, ran down the long room and jumped onto the bed at the same time. Then something moved beneath them. There was a gasp and a cry, and someone said in a muffled voice, "Merciful goodness!" Anne and Diana never knew how they got off the bed and out of the room. They only remembered running and then tiptoeing up the stairs, shivering. "Oh, who was it? What was it?" whispered Anne, her teeth chattering. "It was Aunt Josephine," said Diana, gasping with laughter. "Oh, Anne, it was Aunt Josephine. She's here for a visit. Oh, she's going to be so angry. It's dreadful. But did you ever know anything so funny? Who's your Aunt Josephine? She's my father's aunt. She lives in Charlottetown. She's very old, 70 at least, and I don't think she was ever a little girl. We were expecting her to visit, but not so soon. She's very proper, and she'll be furious. We'll have to sleep with Minnie May, and she kicks a lot. Miss Josephine Barry did not appear at breakfast the next morning. Mrs. Barry smiled kindly at the two little girls. Did you have a good time last night? I tried to stay awake to tell you Aunt Josephine had arrived and that you'd have to sleep upstairs, but I fell asleep. I hope you didn't disturb your Aunt Diana. Diana stayed quiet, but she and Anne exchanged guilty smiles across the table. Anne hurried home after breakfast and didn't hear about the disturbance until that day when she went to Mrs. Lynde's on an errand for Marilla. So you and Diana nearly scared poor old Miss Barry to death last night, said Mrs. Lynde sternly, but with a twinkle in her eye. Mrs. Barry was here on her way to Carmody. She's worried about it. Old Miss Barry was in a terrible mood this morning, and Josephine Barry's temper is no joke, I can tell you. She wouldn't speak to Diana at all. It wasn't Diana's fault, said Anne apologetically. It was mine. I suggested racing to the bed. I knew it, said Mrs. Lynde, pleased with her guess. I knew that idea came from you. Well, it caused a lot of trouble. Old Miss Barry was supposed to stay for a month, but now she says she's leaving tomorrow. She would have gone today if she could. She had promised to pay for a quarter's music lessons for Diana, but now she won't do anything for such a tomboy. Oh, I'm sure there was a lively scene at the Barrys this morning. They must feel upset. Old Miss Barry is rich, and they want to stay on her good side. Mrs. Barry didn't say that exactly, but I'm good at reading people. I'm so unlucky, mourned Anne. I always get into trouble and drag my best friends, people I would do anything for, into it. Can you tell me why, Mrs. Lynde? It's because you're too thoughtless and impulsive, child. You never stop to think. You just do or say whatever comes to your mind without a moment's reflection. Oh, but that's the best part, protested Anne. Something exciting comes into your head, and you have to say it. If you stop to think, it spoils everything. Haven't you ever felt that, Mrs. Lynde? Mrs. Lynde shook her head. You need to learn to think a little, Anne. The proverb you should follow is, look before you leap, especially in spare room beds. Mrs. Lynde laughed at her own joke, but Anne remained thoughtful. She didn't find the situation funny at all. After leaving Mrs. Lynde's, she walked across the fields to Orchard Slope. Diana met her at the kitchen door. Was your Aunt Josephine very angry? Whispered Anne. Yes, answered Anne, stifling a giggle and glancing nervously at the sitting room door. She was furious, Anne. Oh, she scolded us. She said I was the worst behaved girl she ever saw, and that my parents should be ashamed of how they raised me. She says she's leaving, and I don't care, but Father and Mother do. Why didn't you tell them it was my fault? Demanded Anne. As if I'd do that, said Diana indignantly. I'm no telltale, Anne Shirley, and I was just as much to blame as you. Well, I'm going to tell her myself, said Anne resolutely. Diana stared. Anne Shirley, you wouldn't. She'll eat you alive. Don't scare me more than I already am, begged Anne. I'd rather walk up to the cannon's mouth, but I have to do it, Diana. It was my fault, and I have to confess. Luckily, I have experience in confessing. She's in the room, said Diana. You can go in if you want, but I wouldn't dare, and I don't think it will do any good. With this, Anne gathered her courage and knocked on the sitting room door. A sharp "Come in" followed. Miss Josephine Barry, thin and stern, was knitting fiercely by the fire, still angry. She turned around, expecting to see Diana, and instead saw Anne, who looked scared but determined. "Who are you?" demanded Miss Barry. "I'm Anne of Green Gables," said Anne tremulously, clasping her hands as she often did, "and I've come to confess, if you please." "Confess what?" "It was my fault that we jumped on the bed last night. I suggested it. Diana would never have thought of such a thing. Diana is a very ladylike girl, Miss Barry, so it's unfair to blame her." "Oh, is it? I think Diana did her share of the jumping. Such behavior in a respectable house." "But we were only having fun," insisted Anne. "I think you should forgive us, Miss Barry, since we've apologized. Please forgive Diana, and let her have her music lessons. Diana's heart is set on them, and I know what it's like to want something badly and not get it. If you must be angry with me. I'm used to people being cross with me, so I can handle it better than Diana." By now, much of the anger had left Miss Barry's eyes, replaced by a twinkle of amusement. But she still said sternly, "Being only in fun is no excuse. Little girls never acted like that in my day. You can't imagine what it's like to be woken up from a sound sleep by two big girls jumping on you." "I can't imagine, but I can understand," said Anne eagerly. "It must have been very disturbing. But think of our side too. We didn't know anyone was in the bed, and you scared us. It was awful how we felt. And then we couldn't sleep in the spare room after being promised. You must be used to spare rooms, but imagine what it's like for a little orphan girl who's never had that honor." All the anger had gone by this time. Miss Barry actually laughed, a sound that made Diana gasp in relief in the kitchen. "My imagination is a little rusty. It's been so long since I used it," she said. "Maybe your need for sympathy is as great as mine. It all depends on how you look at it. Sit down and tell me about yourself." "I'm very sorry I can't," said Anne firmly. "I'd like to, because you seem interesting and might even be a kindred spirit, though you don't look it. But I have to go home to Miss Marilla Cuthbert. Miss Marilla Cuthbert is very kind and is trying to raise me properly. She's doing her best, but it's not easy. You mustn't blame her because I jumped on the bed. But before I go, I do wish you'd forgive Diana and stay as long as you planned in Avonlea." "I think I will if you come and talk to me sometime," said Miss Barry. That evening, Miss Barry gave Diana a silver bracelet and told the rest of the household that she had unpacked her bags. "I've decided to stay just to get to know that Anne girl better," she said frankly. "She amuses me, and at my age, finding an amusing person is rare." Marilla's only comment when she heard the story was, "I told you so." This was directed at Matthew. Miss Barry stayed her month and more. She was a more pleasant guest than usual, thanks to Anne keeping her entertained. They became good friends. When Miss Barry left, she said, "Remember, Anne girl, when you come to town, you're to visit me, and I'll put you in my very best spare room bed." Miss Barry was a kindred spirit after all, Anne confided to Marilla. "You wouldn't think so at first, but she is. You don't find out right away like with Matthew, but eventually you see it. Kindred spirits aren't as rare as I used to think. It's wonderful to discover there are so many in the world." Chapter 20. A Good Imagination Gone Wrong. Spring had returned to Green Gables, the lovely, unpredictable Canadian spring, slowly making its way through April and May with a mix of fresh, chilly days, pink sunsets, and the magic of new life. The maples in Lover's Lane were budding with red, and little ferns curled up around the dryad's bubble. High up in the barrens, behind Mr. Silas Sloane's house, the mayflowers were blooming, pink and white stars of sweetness hidden under brown leaves. One golden afternoon, all the school children went out to gather them, returning in the cool twilight with their arms and baskets full of flowers. I feel so sorry for people who live in places where there are no Mayflowers, Anne said. Diana thinks they may have something even better, but how could anything be better than Mayflowers? And Diana says if they've never known Mayflowers, they don't miss them. But I think that's the saddest part of all. Don't you, Marilla? Not knowing about Mayflowers and not even missing them? Do you know what I think they are, Marilla? I think they're the souls of the flowers that died last summer, and this is their heaven. Oh, we had such a wonderful time today. We ate our lunch in a mossy hollow by an old well. It was such a romantic spot. Charlie Sloane dared Artie Gillis to jump over it, and Artie did because nobody in school would back down from a dare. Daring is so popular right now. Mr. Phillips gave all the Mayflowers he picked to Prissy Andrews, and I heard him say, "Sweets to the sweet." He got that from a book, I'm sure, but at least it shows he has a bit of imagination. I was offered some Mayflowers too, but I refused with scorn. I can't tell you who offered them because I've sworn never to speak that person's name. We made wreaths from the Mayflowers and wore them on our hats. When it was time to go home, we marched down the road 2 by 2 with our bouquets and wreaths singing "My Home on the Hill." It was so thrilling, Marilla. All of Mr. Silas Sloane's came out to watch us, and everyone we passed stopped and stared. We made quite a sensation. No wonder. What foolishness, said Marilla. After the Mayflowers came the violets, and Violet Vale turned purple with their blooms. Anne walked through it on her way to school, treading lightly and looking around with awe as though she were on sacred ground. Somehow, she told Diana, when I'm here, I don't care if anyone gets ahead of me in class. But once I'm in school, it's all different, and I care just as much as ever. There are so many Annes inside me, Diana. Sometimes I think why I'm so much trouble. If I were just one Anne, life would be simpler, but it wouldn't be as interesting. One June evening, when the orchards were pink with blossoms again, and the frogs sang sweetly in the marshes near the Lake of Shining Waters, Anne sat by her gable window. She had been studying, but it had grown too dark to read, so she gazed dreamily outside, past the flowering boughs of the Snow Queen. Her little room hadn't changed much. The walls were still white, the pincushion just as hard, and the chairs just as stiff and yellow. But the room itself felt transformed. It seemed alive, with a vibrant, pulsing personality. It was as though Anne's dreams, both waking and sleeping, had woven themselves into the room, draping it in shimmering tapestries of rainbow and moonlight. Marilla came in briskly with Anne's freshly ironed aprons, setting them on a chair before sitting down with a sigh. She'd had one of her headaches that afternoon, and though the pain was gone, she still felt drained. Anne looked at her with shining, sympathetic eyes. I wish I could have had your headache instead, Marilla, Anne said earnestly. I'd have gladly endured it for your sake. You did enough by managing the chores and letting me rest, Marilla replied. You didn't do too badly, though I could have done without Matthew's starched handkerchiefs, and most people, when they warm up a pie for dinner, take it out when it's ready instead of burning it to a crisp. But that's not your way, apparently. Marilla's headaches often made her a bit sharp-tongued. Oh, I'm so sorry, said Anne, looking ashamed. I didn't think of that pie again after I put it in the oven, though I did feel something was missing from the table. I promised myself I wouldn't daydream today, but when I put the pie in, I couldn't resist imagining I was an enchanted princess locked in a tower, waiting for a knight on a coal-black horse to rescue me. That's why I forgot the pie. And about the handkerchiefs, I was trying to think of a name for a little island Diana and I discovered by the brook. It's such a beautiful spot, Marilla, with 2 maple trees and the brook running around it. I thought Victoria Island would be perfect since we found it on the Queen's birthday. But I'm really sorry about the pie and the handkerchiefs. I wanted to be extra good today because it's an important anniversary. An anniversary? Marilla asked. I don't remember anything special about today. Oh, Marilla, it's the day I came to Green Gables. It changed my whole life. You might not think it's such a big deal, but it is to me. I've been here a whole year, and I've been so happy. I've had my troubles, but you can live through troubles. Are you sorry you kept me, Marilla? No, I'm not sorry, Marilla said. If you finished your lessons, Anne, I need you to go to Mrs. Barry's and borrow Diana's apron pattern. Anne hesitated. Oh, it's too dark, Marilla. Too dark? It's only twilight, and you've gone over there plenty of times after dark. I'll go early in the morning, Anne said eagerly. I'll get up at sunrise and go then. What's gotten into you, Anne Shirley? I need that pattern to cut out your apron tonight. Go now and don't dawdle. If I have to go, I'll have to take the road, Anne said reluctantly, picking up her hat. Take the road? Waste half an hour going the long way around? I don't think so. I can't go through the haunted wood, Marilla, Anne whispered desperately. Marilla stared. The haunted wood? What nonsense are you talking about now? The spruce grove by the brook, Anne said in a low voice. Ridiculous. There's no such thing as a haunted wood. Who's been filling your head with such silliness? No one, Anne admitted. Diana and I made it up. All the places around here are so ordinary. We wanted something more exciting. We've been pretending it's haunted since April. A haunted wood is so romantic, Marilla. The spruce grove is perfect because it's so gloomy. We imagine the most terrifying things. There's a white lady who walks along the brook at night, wringing her hands and crying. She only appears when someone in the family is going to die. And there's the ghost of a little child who was murdered. It sneaks up behind you and lays its cold fingers on your hand like this. Anne shuddered. And there's a headless man who stalks the path, and skeletons that glare at you from between the trees. Marilla, I couldn't possibly go through the haunted wood at night. I'd be sure something white and ghostly would grab me. Marilla listened in stunned silence. Then she said, Anne Shirley, do you actually believe this ridiculous nonsense you've imagined? Not exactly, Anne admitted. I don't believe it in the daytime. But after dark, Marilla, that's when ghosts come out. There's no such thing as ghosts, Anne, Marilla said firmly. Oh, but there are, Marilla, Anne replied earnestly. I know people who've seen them, and they're respectable people. Charlie Sloane says his grandmother once saw his grandfather driving the cows home a year after he'd been buried. And Mrs. Thomas's father was chased home one night by a lamb with its head hanging by a strip of skin. He was sure it was his brother's spirit warning him he'd die soon. He didn't die right away, but he did 2 years later, so it was true. And Ruby Gillis says, That's enough, Anne, Marilla interrupted sharply. I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense. Your imagination is out of control. You're going to Mrs. Barry's right now, and you'll go through that spruce grove. Maybe this will teach you a lesson about making up such foolishness, and I don't want to hear another word about haunted woods. Anne cried and pleaded, but Marilla was unmoved. Her terror of the haunted wood was real, but Marilla was determined to put an end to it. She marched Anne to the spring and told her to cross the bridge and go through the spruce grove. Marilla, How can you be so cruel?" Anne sobbed. "What if something white grabs me and carries me off?" "I'll take my chances," said Marilla firmly. "Now march. You know I always mean what I say." Anne obeyed. She stumbled over the bridge and into the dark path beyond. She never forgot that walk. Her imagination turned every shadow into a lurking goblin with cold, bony hands reaching for her. A strip of white birch bark blowing in the breeze made her heart stop. The creaking sound of tree branches rubbing together sent shivers down her spine. Bats swooped overhead, their wings like those of ghostly creatures. When she finally reached Mr. William Bell's field, she ran across it as fast as she could and burst into the berry kitchen, out of breath and trembling, to ask for the apron pattern. Diana wasn't home, so Anne couldn't stay. She had no choice but to face the terrifying journey back. She walked through the haunted wood with her eyes shut, preferring the risk of running into a tree to seeing anything ghostly. When she finally stumbled over the bridge, she let out a long, shaky breath of relief. "Well, nothing got you, did it?" Marilla said unsympathetically. "Oh, Marilla," chattered Anne, "I'll be contented with commonplaces after this." Chapter 21. A New Departure in Flavorings. Dear me, there's nothing but meetings and partings in this world, as Mrs. Lynde always says, Anne said with a sigh. She put her slate and books down on the kitchen table on the last day of June and dabbed at her red eyes with a damp handkerchief. "Wasn't it lucky, Marilla, that I brought an extra handkerchief to school today? I had a feeling I'd need it." "I never thought you liked Mr. Phillips so much that you'd need 2 handkerchiefs to cry over his leaving," said Marilla. "I don't think I cried because I was especially fond of him," Anne replied thoughtfully. "I think I cried because everyone else did. Ruby Gillis started it. She always said she hated Mr. Phillips, but as soon as he stood up to give his farewell speech, she burst into tears. Then all the girls started crying one after the other. I tried to hold back, Marilla. I really did. I kept reminding myself of all the times Mr. Phillips was mean to me. The time he made me sit with a boy, or the time he spelled my name without an E on the blackboard, or when he called me the worst dunce he'd ever seen at geometry and laughed at my spelling. Oh, and all the times he was sarcastic. But somehow, none of that mattered at the moment, and I couldn't help it. I had to cry too. Jane Andrews had been saying for weeks how glad she'd be when Mr. Phillips left, and swore she wouldn't shed a tear. But she cried harder than any of us, and even had to borrow a handkerchief from her brother because she didn't bring one. She thought she wouldn't need it. The boys, of course, didn't cry. Oh, Marilla, it was heartbreaking. Mr. Phillips gave such a beautiful farewell speech. He began with, "The time has come for us to part." It was so moving, and he even had tears in his eyes. I felt awful for all the times I'd misbehaved in school, drawn silly pictures of him on my slate, and made fun of him and Prissy. I really wish I'd been a model pupil like Minnie Andrews. She didn't have anything to feel guilty about. The girls cried all the way home from school. Carrie Sloane kept repeating, "The time has come for us to part," and it would start us all off crying again just when we thought we might cheer up. I do feel terribly sad, Marilla, but you can't feel completely in the depths of despair when you've got 2 months of vacation ahead, can you? And besides, something exciting happened. We met the new minister and his wife coming from the station. Even though I was feeling so upset about Mr. Phillips leaving, I couldn't help being a little curious about them, could I? The minister's wife is very pretty. Not exactly what you'd call regally beautiful. That wouldn't be right for a minister's wife, I suppose. Mrs. Lynde says the minister's wife in Newbridge sets a bad example because she dresses so fashionably. Our new minister's wife wore a lovely blue muslin dress with puffed sleeves and a hat trimmed with roses. Jane Andrews thought puffed sleeves were too worldly for a minister's wife, but I didn't say anything unkind like that. I know what it's like to wish for puffed sleeves. And besides, she's only been a minister's wife for a short time. We should give her some grace, shouldn't we? They're going to stay with Mrs. Lynde until the manse is ready. If Marilla had any other reason for going to Mrs. Lynde's that evening besides returning the quilting frame she borrowed last winter, it was a perfectly natural curiosity, one shared by most of the Avonlea community. A new minister, especially one with a wife, was an exciting event in the quiet little settlement where big happenings were rare. Many of Mrs. Lynde's borrowed items, things she had long since lent out and almost given up hope of seeing again, were suddenly returned that evening as neighbors stopped by, eager for a chance to see the newcomers. The previous minister, Mr. Bentley, whom Anne had once described as lacking imagination, had served Avonlea for 18 years. He was a widower when he arrived and stayed that way, despite the fact that gossip regularly paired him off with one woman or another. He resigned in February and left amidst heartfelt farewells from his congregation, who had grown fond of him over the years, even if his sermons weren't particularly inspiring. Since Mr. Bentley's departure, the Avonlea Church had enjoyed a variety of guest preachers filling in every Sunday. These candidates would preach while the congregation decided if they were suitable for the position. The older, respected church members often had the final say, but a certain red-haired girl, sitting quietly in the Cuthbert pew, had plenty of opinions of her own. Anne eagerly shared her thoughts on each preacher with Matthew, as Marilla, on principle, refused to criticize ministers in any way. "I don't think Mr. Smith would have worked out, Matthew," Anne concluded one evening. "Mrs. Lynde says his delivery was poor, but I think his biggest problem was just like Mr. Bentley's. He had no imagination. Mr. Terry, on the other hand, had far too much imagination. It ran away with him, just like mine does sometimes, like when I imagine the haunted wood. And Mrs. Lynde says his theology wasn't sound, which is important, isn't it? Mr. Gresham was a good man and very religious, but he told too many funny stories. People laughed in church, and that's undignified. Ministers need to have dignity, don't you think, Matthew? Now, I thought Mr. Marshall was very attractive, but Mrs. Lynde says he's not married or even engaged. She asked about it specifically and said it would never do to have an unmarried minister in Avonlea. He might marry someone in the congregation, and that would cause trouble. Mrs. Lynde is very wise, isn't she? I'm so glad they decided to call Mr. Allen. I liked him because his sermon was interesting, and when he prayed, it felt like he really meant it, not like he was just doing it because it was expected. Mrs. Lynde says he's not perfect, but then she says we can't expect perfection for $750 a year. Anyway, his theology is sound. She made sure to ask him about every point of doctrine. She also knows his wife's family, and they're very respectable. Mrs. Lynde says all the women in the family are excellent housekeepers. She says sound doctrine in the man and good housekeeping in the woman is the ideal combination for a minister's household. The new minister and his wife were a young, cheerful couple, still enjoying the glow of their honeymoon. They were full of enthusiasm for their life's work, and Avonlea took to them immediately. Everyone, young and old, liked the friendly, high-spirited minister with his noble ideals, and the gentle, bright young woman who gracefully took on the role of mistress of the manse. Anne instantly and completely adored Mrs. Allen. She had discovered another kindred spirit. "Mrs. Allen is just wonderful," Anne declared one Sunday afternoon. "She's taken over our Sunday school class, and she's an amazing teacher." She said right away that it wasn't fair for the teacher to ask all the questions. "You know, Marilla, I've always thought the same thing. She said we could ask her anything we wanted, and I asked a lot of questions. I'm very good at asking questions, Marilla." "I believe you," Marilla replied dryly. "Nobody else asked anything except Ruby Gillis, and she just wanted to know if there'd be a Sunday school picnic this summer. I didn't think that was a very appropriate question, since it had nothing to do with the lesson, which was about Daniel in the lion's den. But Mrs. Allen just smiled and said she thought there probably would be a picnic. Mrs. Allen has the loveliest smile, Marilla, with the sweetest dimples in her cheeks. I wish I had dimples. I'm not as skinny as I was when I first came here, but I still don't have any dimples. If I did, maybe I could influence people for good. Mrs. Allen said we should always try to influence others for good. She talks so nicely about everything. I never knew before that religion could be such a cheerful thing. I always thought it was more serious and gloomy, but Mrs. Allen's isn't like that at all. I'd love to be a Christian if I could be one like her. I wouldn't want to be like Mr. Superintendent Bell." "It's very naughty of you to talk that way about Mr. Bell," said Marilla sternly. "Mr. Bell is a very good man." "Oh, of course he's good," Anne agreed, "but he doesn't seem to enjoy it. If I were good, I'd want to dance and sing all day because I'd be so happy about it. I suppose Mrs. Allen is too old to dance and sing, and it probably wouldn't be dignified for a minister's wife, but you can just tell she's glad to be a Christian. I think she'd still be one, even if she could get to heaven without it." "We should have Mr. and Mrs. Allen over for tea sometime soon," Marilla said thoughtfully. "They've been almost everywhere in Avonlea except here. Let me think. Next Wednesday would be a good day, but don't say a word to Matthew about it. If he knows they're coming, he'll come up with some excuse to be away. He got used to Mr. Bentley over the years, but it's going to be hard for him to get acquainted with a new minister, and a minister's wife. That'll terrify him." "I'll be as secret as the dead," assured Anne. "But oh, Marilla, will you let me make a cake for the occasion? I'd love to do something for Mrs. Allen, and you know, I can make a pretty good cake by this time." "You can make a layer cake," promised Marilla. Monday and Tuesday, great preparations went on at Green Gables. Having the minister and his wife to tea was a serious and important undertaking, and Marilla was determined not to be eclipsed by any of the Avonlea housekeepers. Anne was wild with excitement and delight. She talked it all over with Diana Tuesday night in the twilight, as they sat on the big red stones by the Dryad's bubble and made rainbows in the water with little twigs dipped in fir balsam. "Everything is ready, Diana, except my cake which I'm to make in the morning, and the baking powder biscuits which Marilla will make just before tea time. I assure you, Diana, that Marilla and I have had a busy 2 days of it. It's such a responsibility having a minister's family to tea. I never went through such an experience before. You should just see our pantry. It's a sight to behold. We're going to have jellied chicken and cold tongue. We're to have 2 kinds of jelly, red and yellow, and whipped cream and lemon pie and cherry pie, and 3 kinds of cookies and fruit cake, and Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves that she keeps especially for ministers, and pound cake and layer cake and biscuits, and new bread and old both, in case the minister is dyspeptic and can't eat new. Mrs. Lynde says ministers are dyspeptic, but I don't think Mr. Allen has been a minister long enough for it to have had a bad effect on him. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Diana, what if it shouldn't be good? I dreamed last night that I was chased all around by a fearful goblin with a big layer cake for a head. It'll be good all right, assured Diana, who was a very comfortable sort of friend. I'm sure that piece of the one you made that we had for lunch in Idlewild 2 weeks ago was perfectly elegant. Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out bad just when you especially want them to be good, sighed Anne, setting a particularly well-balsamed twig afloat. However, I suppose I shall just have to trust to Providence and be careful to put in the flour. Oh, look, Diana, what a lovely rainbow! Do you suppose the dryad will come out after we go away and take it for a scarf? You know, there's no such thing as a dryad, said Diana. Diana's mother had found out about the haunted wood and had been decidedly angry over it. As a result, Diana had abstained from any further imitative flights of imagination and did not think it prudent to cultivate a spirit of belief even in harmless dryads. But it's so easy to imagine there is, said Anne. Every night before I go to bed, I look out of my window and wonder if the dryad is really sitting there, combing her locks with the spring for a mirror. Sometimes I look for her footprints in the dew in the morning. Oh, Diana, don't give up your faith in the dryad. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She had caught a severe cold in the head by reason of her dabbling in the spring on the preceding evening, but nothing short of absolute pneumonia could have quenched her interest in culinary matters that morning. After breakfast, she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door upon it, she drew a long breath. I'm sure I didn't forget anything this time, Marilla, but do you think it will rise? What if the baking powder isn't good? I used it from the new can. Mrs. Lynde says you can't trust baking powder these days because everything is so adulterated. She says the government should do something about it, but she also says we'll never see a Tory government tackle such a matter. Oh, Marilla, what if the cake doesn't rise? We'll have plenty without it, said Marilla's practical response. The cake did rise, turning out light and fluffy like golden foam. Anne, thrilled with her success, spread layers of ruby red jelly between its tiers and happily imagined Mrs. Allen eating a slice and perhaps even asking for another. You'll use the best tea set, won't you, Marilla? She asked. And may I decorate the table with ferns and wild roses? I think that's all nonsense, Marilla sniffed. What matters is the food, not frills and decorations. Mrs. Barry decorated her table, Anne pointed out, not entirely above a little strategic persuasion, and the minister paid her a lovely compliment. He said it was a feast for the eyes as well as the palate. Well, do as you like, said Marilla, who was determined not to be outdone by Mrs. Barry or anyone else. Just make sure you leave enough space for the dishes and food. Anne threw herself into decorating the table with great enthusiasm. Using plenty of roses and ferns and her own artistic flair, she transformed the tea table into such a lovely sight that when the minister and his wife sat down, they exclaimed in delight at its beauty. It's all Anne's doing, Marilla said, grudgingly fair, as the guests admired the setup. Anne felt as though Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness to bear. Even Matthew was present, though only Anne knew how she had managed to convince him to come. He had been so shy and nervous about meeting the minister and his wife that Marilla had given up hope of his staying, but Anne had coaxed him successfully. Now he sat at the table in his best clothes and a white collar, making polite conversation with the minister. He didn't say a word to Mrs. Allen, but that wasn't entirely unexpected. Everything went smoothly until Anne's layer cake was served. Mrs. Allen had already tried an impressive variety of treats, politely declined at first. However, Marilla, noticing Anne's crestfallen expression, said with a smile, "Oh, you must try this, Mrs. Allen. Anne made it especially for you." "In that case, I must have a piece," laughed Mrs. Allen, taking a generous slice. The minister and Marilla did the same. Mrs. Allen took a bite, and a strange expression flickered across her face. She said nothing, but continued to eat, though slowly. Marilla, catching the look, quickly tasted the cake herself. "Anne Shirley," she exclaimed, "what on earth did you put in this cake?" "Nothing but what the recipe said," Anne cried, her voice filled with distress. "Oh, isn't it all right?" "All right? It's dreadful. Mr. Allen, don't eat it. Anne, taste it yourself. What flavoring did you use?" "Vanilla," Anne said, her face red with embarrassment after tasting the cake. "Oh, vanilla. Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder. I suspected it might be bad." "Baking powder? Nonsense. Go get me the bottle of vanilla you used." Anne dashed to the pantry and returned with a bottle labeled Best Vanilla. Marilla uncorked it and sniffed, then gave a horrid gasp. "Mercy on us, Anne. You flavored the cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week and poured what was left in an old vanilla bottle. It's partly my fault. I should have warned you. But why didn't you smell it?" "I couldn't. I had such a bad cold," Anne wailed before fleeing to her room, where she flung herself onto her bed and cried as if her heart would break. Soon, light footsteps sounded on the stairs, and someone entered the room. "Oh, Marilla," Anne sobbed without looking up. "I'm ruined forever. Everyone will hear about this. Things always get out in Avonlea. Diana will ask how my cake turned out, and I'll have to tell her the truth. The boys at school will never stop laughing at me. Oh, Marilla, if you have a shred of pity, don't make me go downstairs to wash the dishes tonight. I'll do it after they leave, but I can't face Mrs. Allen again. She'll think I tried to poison her. Mrs. Lynde always says she knows an orphan girl who poisoned her benefactor, but the liniment isn't poisonous. It's meant to be taken internally, just not in cakes. Marilla, won't you tell her that?" "Why don't you get up and tell her yourself?" said a cheerful voice. Anne jumped up to see Mrs. Allen standing by the bed, her eyes full of laughter. "My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this," said Mrs. Allen, genuinely concerned. "It was just a funny mistake that anyone could make." "Oh, no, it takes me to make a mistake like that," Anne said miserably. "I wanted so much for the cake to be perfect for you." "And I appreciate your kindness and thoughtfulness just as much as if it had been perfect," Mrs. Allen said warmly. "Now, dry your tears and come show me your flower garden. Mrs. Cuthbert tells me you have a little plot of your own, and I'm very interested in flowers." Anne allowed herself to be led outside, comforted by the thought that Mrs. Allen was truly a kindred spirit. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake, and Anne found that, despite the incident, she had enjoyed the evening more than she expected. As the guests left, Anne sighed deeply and said, "Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a fresh day with no mistakes in it yet?" "I'm sure you'll fill it with plenty of mistakes," Marilla replied. "I've never known anyone like you for making them." "Yes, I know," Anne said mournfully. "But haven't you noticed one good thing about me, Marilla? I never make the same mistake twice." "I'm not sure that's much comfort when you're always finding new ones to make." "Oh, but don't you see, Marilla? There has to be a limit to the number of mistakes one person can make. When I've made them all, I'll be done with them. That's such a comforting thought. Well, you'd better take that cake out to the pigs, said Marilla. It's not fit for any human to eat, not even Jerry Butte. Chapter 22. Anne is invited out to tea. And what has your face all lit up now? Marilla asked, when Anne came bursting into the house after a trip to the post office. Have you found another kindred spirit? Excitement surrounded Anne like a halo. It sparkled in her eyes and lit up her whole face. She had come dancing up the lane like a little sprite blown along by the August breeze through the golden sunlight and lazy shadows of the evening. No, Marilla, but oh, guess what? I've been invited to tea at the manse tomorrow afternoon. Mrs. Allen left a letter for me at the post office. Just look at it. Miss Anne Shirley, Green Gables. That's the first time anyone has ever called me Miss. It gave me such a thrill. I'll keep this letter forever as one of my most treasured possessions. Mrs. Allen told me she planned to invite all the girls from her Sunday school class for tea in turn, Marilla said with little enthusiasm. There's no need to get so worked up about it. You really should learn to take things calmly, Anne. But for Anne to be calm would have meant changing her very nature. She was all spirit and fire and dew, and life's joys and sorrows always struck her with heightened intensity. Marilla felt uneasy about this, convinced that Anne's impulsive nature would make the highs and lows of life especially hard on her. What she didn't fully understand was that Anne's capacity for delight would make up for her deep disappointments. Still, Marilla believed it her duty to mold Anne into a calm, steady little girl, a task as futile as trying to pin down a dancing sunbeam. Marilla often despaired of her goal, though she would never admit that she liked Anne better just as she was. That night, Anne was utterly miserable at bedtime. Matthew had remarked that the wind was blowing northeast, which likely meant rain the next day. The rustling of the poplar leaves outside sounded to Anne's worried ears like pattering raindrops, and the deep, distant roar of the Gulf, usually a sound she loved, seemed to her like an ominous warning of storm and disaster. She lay awake for hours, willing the morning to come. But all things come to an end eventually, even the night before an invitation to tea. Morning arrived, clear and sunny, despite Matthew's gloomy prediction, and Anne's spirits soared. Oh, Marilla, I feel like I could just love everybody today, Anne declared as she washed the breakfast dishes. I feel so happy and good. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could feel this way all the time? I think I could be a model child if I were invited to tea every day, but it's also such a solemn occasion. I'm so nervous, Marilla. What if I don't behave properly? I've never been to tea at a manse before, and I don't know all the rules of etiquette. I've been studying the Family Herald's etiquette department ever since I came here, but what if I forget something? Is it bad manners to take a second helping if you really want one? The trouble with you, Anne, is that you think too much about yourself, said Marilla wisely. You should focus on Mrs. Allen and what would be nicest for her. Anne paused, immediately recognizing the truth in this. You're right, Marilla. I'll try not to think about myself at all. Anne must have followed Marilla's advice successfully, because she came home that evening through a sky glowing with pink and gold clouds in a blissful state of contentment. She sat on the big red sandstone slab by the kitchen door, her tired curly head resting in Marilla's gingham lap, and eagerly told her about the visit. A cool wind was drifting down from the hills, rustling through the poplars and sweeping across the harvest fields. One bright star shone above the orchard, and fireflies flickered in Lover's Lane among the ferns and branches. As Anne talked, she watched the stars and fireflies, feeling as if everything, wind, light, and shadows, were woven together into something magical. Oh, Marilla, I had the most fascinating time. I feel like I've truly lived today. Even if I'm never invited to the manse again, I'll always remember this. When I arrived, Mrs. Allen met me at the door. She was wearing the loveliest pale pink organdy dress with frills and elbow sleeves. She looked like an angel. I think I'd like to be a minister's wife when I grow up, Marilla. A minister wouldn't mind my red hair because he wouldn't be thinking of such worldly things. But of course, you'd have to be naturally good, and I'm not. Some people are just naturally good, and others aren't. I'm one of the others. Mrs. Lynde says I'm full of original sin, and no matter how hard I try to be good, I'll never succeed the way naturally good people do. But don't you think trying so hard should count for something? Mrs. Allen is naturally good, and I love her so much. There are some people, like Matthew and Mrs. Allen, who you just love instantly without even trying. And then there are people like Mrs. Lynde. You know you should love them because they're smart and hardworking, but you have to remind yourself constantly. Anne continued, There was another little girl there from the White Sands Sunday School. Her name is Loretta Bradley, and she was very nice. Not exactly a kindred spirit, but still nice. We had such an elegant tea, and I think I followed all the rules of etiquette. After tea, Mrs. Allen played the piano and sang. Then she asked Loretta and me to sing too. Can you believe it, Marilla? Mrs. Allen says I have a good voice and should sing in the Sunday school choir. I've wanted to join for so long, but never thought I could. I can't wait. Loretta had to leave early because her sister was reciting at a big concert at the White Sands Hotel tonight. The Americans at the hotel hold concerts every 2 weeks to raise money for the Charlottetown Hospital, and they ask the locals to perform. Loretta said she expects to be asked to recite someday. I just stared at her in awe. After she left, Mrs. Allen and I had the most wonderful heart-to-heart talk. I told her everything about Mrs. Thomas, the twins, Katie, Maurice, and Violetta, and all my troubles with geometry. And would you believe it, Marilla? Mrs. Allen told me she was terrible at geometry too. That encouraged me so much. Oh, and Mrs. Lynde came to the manse just before I left. Guess what? The trustees have hired a new teacher, and it's a lady. Her name is Miss Muriel Stacy. Isn't that a romantic name? Mrs. Lynde says there's never been a female teacher in Avonlea before, and that it's a dangerous change. But I think it's wonderful, and I don't know how I'll survive the next 2 weeks before school starts. I'm so excited to meet her. Chapter 23. Anne Comes to Grief in an Affair of Honor. Anne had to live through more than 2 weeks, as it turned out. It had been almost a month since the liniment cake incident, so it was high time for her to get into fresh trouble. Small mistakes, like absent-mindedly pouring a pan of skim milk into a basket of yarn balls in the pantry instead of into the pig's bucket, or walking right off the edge of the log bridge into the brook while lost in one of her imaginative daydreams, didn't really count. A week after the tea at the manse, Diana Barry gave a party. Small and select, Anne assured Marilla, just the girls in our class. They had a very good time, and nothing untoward happened until after tea, when they found themselves in the berry garden, a little tired of their games and ripe for any enticing form of mischief which might present itself. This presently took the form of daring. Daring was the fashionable amusement among the Avonlea small fry just then. It had begun among the boys, but soon spread to the girls, and all the silly things that were done in Avonlea that summer, because the doers thereof were dared to do them, would fill a book by themselves. First, Carrie Sloane dared Ruby Gillis to climb to a certain height in the large willow tree by the front door. Despite her terror of the fat green caterpillars that infested the tree, and her fear of her mother's anger if she tore her new muslin dress, Ruby bravely climbed up, much to Carrie Sloane's disappointment. Then Josie Pye dared Jane Andrews to hop on her left leg all the way around the garden without stopping or letting her right foot touch the ground. Jane gave it her best shot, but gave up at the third corner, admitting defeat. Josie's victory, being far more triumphant than was polite, prompted Anne Shirley to dare her to walk along the top of the board fence that bordered the garden on the east side. Walking on board fences requires far more balance and skill than someone who has never tried it might think. However, if Josie Pye lacked certain qualities that made her likable, she did possess a natural talent, well practiced, for walking board fences. With an air of effortless confidence, Josie strolled along the berry fence as if the challenge were hardly worth her time. Her performance was met with reluctant admiration, as most of the other girls, having struggled with fence walking themselves, could appreciate the skill it required. Josie climbed down, flushed with triumph, and shot a defiant look at Anne. Anne simply tossed her red braids. "I don't think walking a little low-board fence is such a big deal," Anne said coolly. "I knew a girl in Marysville who could walk along the ridgepole of a roof." "I don't believe it," Josie said bluntly. "I don't think anyone could walk a ridgepole. You couldn't do it, that's for sure." "Couldn't I?" Anne said impulsively. "Then I dare you to do it," Josie challenged, her tone defiant. "I dare you to climb up there and walk along the ridgepole of Mr. Barry's kitchen roof." Anne's face turned pale, but it was clear there was only one way to respond. She headed toward the house, where a ladder leaned against the kitchen roof. The fifth-class girls gasped in unison, part excitement, part alarm. "Don't do it, Anne," begged Diana. "You'll fall and be killed. Don't pay any attention to Josie Pye. It's not fair to dare someone to do something so dangerous." "I have to do it. My honor's at stake," Anne said solemnly. "I will walk that ridgepole, Diana, or die trying. If I don't make it, you're to have my pearl bead ring." Amid a tense and breathless silence, Anne climbed the ladder, reached the ridgepole, and carefully balanced herself upright on the narrow, unstable surface. The height made her dizzy, and she quickly realized that walking along a ridgepole wasn't something imagination could help her with. Still, she managed to take a few steps before disaster struck. She wobbled, lost her balance, stumbled, and fell, sliding down the hot, sun-baked roof and crashing into the Virginia creeper below. The stunned circle of girls below barely had time to let out a collective, horrified scream. If Anne had fallen on the side where she had climbed up, Diana might indeed have inherited the pearl bead ring then and there. Thankfully, she tumbled down the other side, where the roof sloped down over the porch, making the fall much less dangerous. Still, when Diana and the others rushed frantically around the house, except for Ruby Gillis, who froze in place and went into hysterics, they found Anne lying pale and motionless among the broken vines of the Virginia creeper. "Anne, are you dead?" Diana cried, dropping to her knees beside her friend. "Oh, Anne, dear Anne, just say one word. Tell me you're alive." To the immense relief of all the girls, and especially Josie Pye, who, despite her lack of imagination, was already picturing a future where she'd forever be blamed for Anne Shirley's tragic and untimely death, Anne sat up unsteadily and said faintly, "No, Diana, I'm not killed, but I think I have been rendered unconscious," Anne said faintly. "Where?" sobbed Carrie Sloane. "Oh, where, Anne?" Before Anne could reply, Mrs. Barry arrived on the scene. Seeing her, Anne tried to get to her feet, but immediately sank back with a small cry of pain. "What happened? Where are you hurt?" Mrs. Barry demanded. "My ankle," Anne managed to gasp. "Oh, Diana, please find your father and ask him to take me home. I know I'll never be able to walk there, and I'm certain I couldn't hop all the way when Jane couldn't even hop around the garden." Marilla was in the orchard, gathering a pan of summer apples when she noticed Mr. Barry crossing the log bridge and coming up the slope toward Green Gables. Mrs. Barry walked beside him, followed by a small crowd of girls. In Mr. Barry's arms, Marilla saw Anne, her head resting limply on his shoulder. At that moment, a sharp pang of fear pierced Marilla's heart, and she was struck by revelation. She suddenly realized just how much Anne meant to her. She had always admitted to herself that she liked Anne, perhaps even that she was fond of her. But now, as she rushed anxiously down the slope, she understood the truth. Anne was dearer to her than anything else in the world. "Mr. Barry, what has happened to her?" Marilla gasped, looking more pale and shaken than she had been in years. The usually composed and practical Marilla was clearly distressed. Anne raised her head slightly and answered herself. "Don't be too frightened, Marilla. I was walking on the ridgepole, and I fell. I think I've sprained my ankle. But, Marilla, I could have broken my neck. Let's try to look on the bright side of things. I might have known you'd go and do something like this when I let you go to that party," Marilla said sharply, her tone a mix of relief and exasperation. "Bring her in here, Mr. Barry, and lay her on the sofa. Mercy, the child has gone and fainted." It was true. Overcome by the pain, Anne had fainted, fulfilling one of her secret wishes to experience a dramatic swoon. Matthew was hurriedly called in from the harvest field and sent to fetch the doctor. When the doctor arrived, he discovered that Anne's injury was more serious than they had thought. Her ankle was broken. That night, when Marilla went upstairs to the east gable, where Anne lay pale and quiet, a soft, plaintive voice greeted her from the bed. "Marilla, aren't you very sorry for me?" Anne asked gently. "It was your own fault," Marilla said firmly, pulling down the blind and lighting the lamp. "And that's exactly why you should feel sorry for me," Anne replied. "The fact that it's all my own fault is what makes it so much harder to bear. If I could blame someone else, I'd feel so much better. But, Marilla, what would you have done if you'd been dared to walk a ridgepole?" "I'd have stayed on good solid ground and let them dare all they liked," Marilla said with a disapproving sniff. "Such nonsense." Anne sighed deeply. "But you have such strength of mind, Marilla. I don't. I just couldn't bear the thought of Josie Pye mocking me for the rest of my life. She would have lorded it over me forever. I think I've been punished enough, though, so you don't need to be too cross with me. Fainting wasn't nice at all, and the doctor hurt me terribly when he set my ankle. Now I won't be able to walk around for 6 or 7 weeks. and I'll miss out on the new lady teacher. By the time I can go back to school, she won't be new anymore, and Gil, everyone will get ahead of me in class. Oh, Marilla, I'm such a miserable soul, but I'll try to be brave about it all, as long as you promise not to be angry with me." "There, I'm not cross," said Marilla. "You're an unlucky child, no doubt about that. But as you said, you'll be the one to bear the suffering. Now try to eat your supper." "Isn't it lucky I've got such a vivid imagination?" Anne said. "I think it will help me get through this wonderfully. What do you think people without imagination do when they break their bones, Marilla?" Anne's imagination indeed proved to be a great comfort to her many times during the long, tedious 7 weeks that followed. But she didn't have to rely on it entirely. She had plenty of visitors, and not a single day passed without at least one or more of her schoolmates stopping by to bring her flowers, books, and news about everything happening in the lively world of Avonlea's children. "Everybody has been so good and kind, Marilla," Anne said with a happy sigh on the day she managed to limp across the floor for the first time. "Being laid up isn't very pleasant, but there's a bright side to it. You find out how many friends you have. Even Superintendent Bell came to see me. He's really quite a fine man. Not a kindred spirit, of course, but I like him. I'm truly sorry I ever criticized his prayers. I think he does mean them. He's just fallen into the habit of saying them as if he doesn't. He could change that if he put a little effort. I gave him a broad hint by telling him how hard I try to make my own private prayers interesting. He told me all about the time he broke his ankle when he was a boy. Can you imagine Superintendent Bell as a boy? I can't. My imagination fails me there. When I try to picture him, I just see a smaller version of him now, with gray whiskers and spectacles, sitting in Sunday school. But Mrs. Allen is so easy to imagine as a little girl. She visited me 14 times, Marilla. Isn't that something to be proud of, considering all the demands on her time as a minister's wife? She's so cheerful and kind. She never tells me it's my own fault, or says she hopes I'll be a better girl because of it. Mrs. Lynde always said that when she visited me, and in a tone that made me feel she didn't believe I actually would be better. Even Josie Pye came to see me. I treated her as politely as I could, because I think she's sorry she dared me to walk the ridgepole. If I'd been killed, she'd have to carry a terrible burden of guilt all her life. Diana has been a true friend, Marilla. She comes over every single day to cheer me up. But oh, I can't wait to go back to school. I've heard such exciting things about the new teacher. All the girls say Mrs. Stacy is absolutely lovely. Diana says she has the prettiest fair curly hair and such fascinating eyes. She dresses beautifully, and her sleeve puffs are bigger than anyone else's in Avonlea. Every other Friday she has recitations, and everyone has to either say a piece or act in a dialogue. Isn't that thrilling? Josie Pye says she hates it, but that's just because Josie has so little imagination. Diana, Ruby Gillis, and Jane Andrews were working on a dialogue called A Morning Visit for next Friday. On the Fridays, they don't have recitations. Miss Stacy takes the whole class into the woods for a field day, where they study ferns, flowers, and birds. They even have physical exercises every morning and evening. Mrs. Lynde says she's never heard of such things, and that it's all because we have a lady teacher. But I think it's wonderful, and I just know Miss Stacy will be a kindred spirit. One thing is clear, Anne, Marilla said dryly. Falling off the berry roof didn't do any damage to your tongue. Chapter 24. Miss Stacy and her pupils get up a concert. It was October again by the time Anne was ready to return to school. A glorious October, glowing with red and gold. The mornings were mellow, and the valleys were filled with delicate mists, as if autumn itself had poured them in for the sun to evaporate, shades of amethyst, pearl, silver, rose, and smoky blue. The heavy dew made the fields shimmer like cloth of silver, and hollows of the many-stemmed woods were piled with rustling leaves, perfect for running through with a crisp crunch. The birch path was a golden canopy of yellow, and the ferns along it had turned brown and dry. There was a tang in the air that seemed to spark excitement in the hearts of small maidens, who, unlike snails, skipped eagerly to school. It felt wonderful to be back at the little brown desk beside Diana, with Ruby Gillis nodding across the aisle, Carrie Sloane sending notes, and Julia Bell passing a chew of gum from the back seat. Anne took a deep, contented breath as she sharpened her pencil and arranged her picture cards neatly in her desk. Life was undeniably interesting. In the new teacher, Miss Stacy, Anne found another true and supportive friend. Miss Stacy was a bright and understanding young woman with a natural ability to win the affection of her pupils and inspire the best in them, both mentally and morally. Under her positive influence, Anne blossomed like a flower. She eagerly brought home glowing reports of schoolwork and new goals to share with the admiring Matthew and the ever-critical Marilla. "I love Miss Stacy with my whole heart, Marilla," Anne declared passionately. "She is so ladylike, and her voice is so sweet. When she says my name, I can just feel that she's spelling it with an E. We had recitations this afternoon, and oh, I wish you could have heard me recite Mary, Queen of Scots. I put my whole soul into it. Ruby Gillis told me on the way home that the way I said the line, 'Now for my father's arm,' she said, 'my woman's heart farewell,' gave her chills. Isn't that thrilling?" "Well now, you might recite it for me one of these days out in the barn," suggested Matthew. "Of course I will," Anne replied thoughtfully. "But I know I won't be able to do it as well. It's not as thrilling when there isn't a whole school hanging on your every word. I'm sure I won't be able to make your blood run cold." "Mrs. Lynde says her blood ran cold last Friday, watching the boys climb to the very tops of those big trees on Bell's Hill after crow's nests," said Marilla. "I wonder at Mrs. Stacy for encouraging that sort of thing." "But we needed a crow's nest for nature study," Anne explained. "It was during our field afternoon. Field afternoons are wonderful, Marilla, and Miss Stacy explains everything so beautifully. We have to write compositions afterward, and mine are the best." "It is very vain of you to say that. You should let your teacher be the one to say it." "But she did say it, Marilla, and I'm not vain about it, truly. How could I be when I'm such a dunce at geometry? Although, to be fair, I'm starting to understand it a little. Miss Stacy makes it so clear. Even so, I'll never be good at it, and that's a humbling thought. But I absolutely love writing compositions. Most of the time, Miss Stacy lets us pick our own topics. But next week, we have to write about a remarkable person. It's so hard to choose, with so many remarkable people who ever lived. Isn't it amazing to think about being so remarkable that people write compositions about you after you're gone? Oh, I'd love to be remarkable. I think when I grow up, I might become a trained nurse and join the Red Cross to help on battlefields as a messenger of mercy. That is, unless I decide to become a foreign missionary instead. That would be very romantic, Anne continued, but one would have to be very good to be a missionary, and that might be a stumbling block. We also have physical culture exercises every day. They're supposed to make you graceful and improve digestion. Promote fiddlesticks, said Marilla, who firmly believed it was all nonsense. However, the field afternoons, recitation Fridays, and physical culture exercises all seemed insignificant compared to a project Miss Stacy introduced in November. She proposed that the students of Avonlea School organize a concert to be held in the hall on Christmas night. The goal was to raise money for a schoolhouse flag, and the idea was met with unanimous enthusiasm from the pupils. Among all the excited performers-to-be, none was as thrilled as Anne Shirley, who threw herself into the preparations with heart and soul, despite Marilla's disapproval. It's all filling your heads with nonsense and wasting time that should be spent on your lessons, Marilla grumbled. I don't approve of children getting up concerts and running around to practices. It makes them vain, forward, and too fond of gallivanting. But think of the worthy cause, Anne pleaded. A flag will inspire a spirit of patriotism, Marilla. Fudge, there's not an ounce of patriotism in any of your minds, Marilla retorted. All you care about is having a good time. Well, if you can combine patriotism with fun, isn't that even better? Anne reasoned. It's so exciting to be part of a concert. We're going to have 6 choruses, and Diana is singing a solo. I'm in 2 dialogues, the Society for the Suppression of Gossip and the Fairy Queen. The boys are doing a dialogue too, and I have 2 recitations, Marilla. I tremble just thinking about it, but it's the kind of thrilling tremble that's actually nice. We're ending with a tableau, Faith, Hope, and Charity. Diana, Ruby, and I will be in it, dressed in white with our hair flowing. I'm going to be Hope, with my hands clasped like this, Anne demonstrated, and my eyes lifted up. I'll practice my recitations in the garret. Don't be alarmed if you hear me groaning. It's for one of the recitations. It's so hard to create a good artistic groan, Marilla. Josie Pye is sulking because she didn't get the role she wanted in the Fairy Queen. She thought she should be the queen, but that would have been ridiculous. Who ever heard of a Fairy Queen as plump as Josie? Fairy Queens need to be slender. Jane Andrews is the queen, and I'm one of her maids of honor. Josie says a red-haired fairy is just as absurd as a fat one, but I won't let her bother me. I'll be wearing a wreath of white roses in my hair, and Ruby Gillis is lending me her slippers, since I don't have any. You can't imagine a fairy wearing boots, especially copper-toed ones, can you? We're decorating the hall with creeping spruce and fir, and we're making mottos with pink tissue paper roses. Once the audience is seated, we'll march in pairs while Emma White plays a march on the organ. Oh, Marilla, I know you're not as excited about this as I am, but don't you hope your little Anne will make you proud? All I hope is that you'll behave yourself, Marilla replied. I'll be glad when this whole fuss is over so you can settle down again. Right now, you're good for nothing with your head crammed full of dialogues, groans, and tableaus. As for your tongue, it's a wonder it hasn't worn itself out completely. Anne sighed and made her way to the backyard, where a young crescent moon was casting its glow through the bare poplar branches against an apple-green western sky. Matthew was there, splitting wood, and Anne perched herself on a block nearby, ready to discuss the concert with someone she knew would be a sympathetic and encouraging listener. Well now, I reckon it's going to be a pretty good concert, and I expect you'll do your part just fine, Matthew said. smiling down at her animated, eager face. Anne returned his smile warmly. The two of them were the best of friends, and Matthew often thanked his lucky stars that he had no responsibility in raising her. That was entirely Marilla's task. If it had been up to him, he would have been torn between doing what was right and indulging her whims. But since the duty of bringing up Anne fell to Marilla, Matthew felt free to spoil Anne, as Marilla often put it, as much as he pleased. In truth, it wasn't such a bad arrangement. A little appreciation and kindness, Matthew thought, often did just as much good as all the conscientious bringing up in the world. Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.